Welcome to the Age of Cathedrals. My name is Professor Howard Block, Sterling Professor of French at Yale University, and a specialist in the literature and art history of the Middle Ages. We shall explore together one of the great moments of turning in the West, and we shall discover some of the most amazing architectural structures ever built, as well as the world around them. But let's begin by asking, what is a cathedral? The word cathedral comes from the Latin cathedra, meaning an easy chair, and came to mean the church, or the seat of a bishop, or the church of a bishop's seat. As the seat of a bishop, the cathedral functioned as the central church of a diocese, which derives from the Greek word for administration, and serves as the church district under the supervision of a bishop. The diocese, or bishopric, may be divided into smaller units, or parishes, under the care of a priest. As the principal church of the bishop, the cathedral, or throne, came to be known for its architectural size and its astonishing beauty. Cathedrals first appeared in Italy, Spain, North Africa, and what was then known as Gaul, and now known as France, in the 4th century of the Christian era, after centuries of persecution of Christians by the Romans. But as the persecutions ended, Christianity was declared the official religion of the Roman Empire by the Emperor Constantine in 312 AD. The Great Age of Cathedrals began a little later, however, in the 12th century in France, more precisely in the Île-de-France, the area in and around Paris. From Paris, the great stone churches spread all over Europe, where for a remarkable period of 150 years, some 80 Gothic cathedrals were built, with many more spread over the rest of Western and Central Europe. Almost all are still standing today. Please join me in visiting some of the most remarkable buildings the world has ever known, as we explore the history and culture that gave rise to medieval cathedrals, and we try to understand how and why they continue to live and have meaning for our world, our own age. Paris of the 12th century was one of the great stopping places of history. The city had been settled by a Celtic tribe, the Parisii, in the 3rd century BC. And the Parisii were conquered by the Romans, who in 52 BC established a Gallo-Roman settlement in and around the Île de la Cité, known as Lutetia Parisiorum, or the place near a swamp of the tribe known as the Parisii. Here we see an image of what Paris might have looked like under Roman rule. Those of you who have been to Paris might recognize the Roman arena, which is still standing, the Roman thermal baths, which are now part of the Cluny Museum of the Middle Ages in Paris's 5th arrondissement, and the Île de la Cité, on which the Cathedral of Notre Dame will be built some 10 centuries later. In this rendering, we still see the vestiges of swamps along what is now Paris's left bank. But before we get to the building of cathedrals, let's back up a little to the early history of Paris, which was not always as peaceful as it is today, or even as it was in the 12th century. France was Christianized in the 3rd century of the Christian era and occupied by the Germanic king Clovis, who, at the urging of his wife Clotilde, converted to Christianity in 496. Clovis made Paris his capital in 508. In the second half of the 8th century, Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, whom we shall encounter when we read the Song of Roland, had managed to unite all of Europe under his rule and maintain relative peace throughout his empire. But when he died in 814, Europe found itself vulnerable to invasions. Muslims swept in from the Mediterranean, Magyars from the east, and Vikings or Norsemen from Scandinavia. In 845, Paris was attacked by Viking invaders, who sailed their fierce long ships up the Seine. Axe-bearing warriors from the north scaled the city walls and looted and burned what they could. Charlemagne's grandson, Charles the Bald, paid 7,000 pounds tribute to keep the Viking raiders at bay. But the same thing happened in 876 and again in 885. Finally, the French King Charles the Simple concluded a peace treaty with the Viking leader Rollo in the year 911, and the decades of peace, which grew into centuries of peace, meant that Paris prospered as it never could have in the chaos following Charlemagne's death. The population of the city grew from an estimated 20,000 at the low point of the Viking raids to an estimated 110,000 in the year 1200 to some 250,000 at the time of the Black Death of 1348, which may have killed as many as 800 people a day. This was also a period of tremendous economic growth, with the opening of long-range trade routes between the Middle East and the North, between England, the Low Countries, Italy, and France, all of which accompanied the growth in population. And it was a period in which the rural economy of what the historian Mark Bloch called the first feudal age gave way to a rise of cities, with all that cities imply by way of money, commerce, markets, and judicial institutions. New urban social arrangements like the municipal government of the commune, artisan guilds and corporations, universities, and among the most impressive and enduring architectural monuments of the world, Gothic cathedrals. Here we see a somewhat later image of medieval Paris by the painter Jean Fouquet, who lived in the 15th century. Note the peaceful boat that has replaced the fierce Viking warships, and on the left side of Jean Fouquet's painting, the towering presence of the Cathedral of Notre Dame, which dominated not only the skyline, but the life of the medieval city. One gets some idea of the importance of the cathedral through the hand of God that descends in the middle of the top of the painting alongside the church. Together, they ward off evil in the form of hideous demons circulating in the sky. Paris had long been a religious site, going back to pre-Christian times. Pagan shrines and a Gallo-Roman wall stood on the Île de la Cité in the heart of the Roman settlement of Lutetia. Here we see some of the archaeological vestiges of Paris of the 4th and 5th centuries, which were only discovered in the 1960s when the French began to build an underground parking lot under the plaza in front of the Cathedral of Notre Dame. An early basilica stood where Notre Dame now stands, built in the 4th century, when the Bishop of Paris assumed a certain religious authority as the result of Emperor Constantine's making Christianity the official religion of state. A Merovingian church, here seen in a visual recreation, was built in Paris in the 6th century, possibly under the reign of the Frankish king Childebert, who died in 558. The Church of St. Stephen stood on the site to the west of the current Notre Dame when the present cathedral was begun in the second half of the 12th century. Under the guidance of the Bishop of Paris, Maurice de Sully, the cornerstone of the choir of Notre Dame was laid in 1163 in the presence of Pope Alexander III. As the building of the choir of the church progressed, within a matter of 20 years, a wall unlike any other that had ever been seen was erected along its south side. This wall is still standing, as we see in the picture of Notre Dame from the left or south bank of the Seine, and we see why it's still standing from this cross-sectional drawing by the great architect and builder Eugène Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc, who restored Notre Dame in the middle of the 19th century to the state in which it still stands today. This wall, which was partially inside of the main structure and partially outside, was known as a flying buttress and was meant to offset the extraordinary lateral pressure exerted by a very wide ceiling vault, which had not yet been put into place and which otherwise would not have been able to stand. So new and so innovative was the great high structure of Notre Dame, the flying buttress, that at least one astonished witness, a Norman monk and chronicler by the name of Robert de Torigny, exclaimed that if it is ever completed, nothing will be able to compare with it. Others were terrified and saw in a building so high a violation of the law of God. The distinguished Parisian theologian Peter the Chanter wrote in the year 1180 that it is a sin to build this kind of church, which is being built nowadays. It is a sickness of epidemic proportions. The choir, or eastern end of Notre Dame, was completed along with the high altar and consecrated on May 19, 1182, by the papal legate. Here we look down the nave, or the central part of the cathedral, toward the altar, which stood at the center of the cathedral between the nave, or the westernmost part, and the choir. In May 1185, Heraclius, Archbishop of Caesarea and Patriarch of Jerusalem, declared the Third Crusade on the steps of Notre Dame. And by the time the western facade, which we are looking at now, and the nave were built over the course of the next 50 years, its spectacularly high walls, supported by flying buttresses, had set a style, and was for a time, but only a time, the world's tallest church, with its vault of 32.8 meters, or 107 feet, from the ground. In relatively short order, however, the great churches at Noyon, at Sens, at Chartres, Bourges, Amiens, Laon, Le Mans, and Beauvais all surpassed Notre Dame de Paris in height. Chartres overtook Notre Dame de Paris in 1194 with a vault of 120 feet. The vault of Reims reached almost 125 feet in the year 1212, and the one at Amiens 139 feet in 1221. Each new city tried to outdo the others in the height of its cathedral. Begun in 1225, Beauvais outdid them all, with a choir vault so high, 157 feet, that it collapsed in the year 1284. All the cities adopted the high style of the high wall in the great wave of cathedral building that swept from the Parisian basin to the rest of France and eventually to all of Europe. In the decades surrounding the erection of the great new wall at Notre Dame, innovation itself, the appreciation of what is new, came to constitute a core value in a world which had until then valued principally the past. Theologians, clergymen, statesmen, great feudal princes, the knights in their service, and the common people had all been convinced that the world would end around the year 1000, a belief in the process of the last days, in the phrase of the Norman monk Raoul Glauber. A belief that the world was about to end may have curtailed building big and building high. But when the world did not end, it is as if the survivors of the cataclysm that never came were forced to recognize that the present was here to stay. Building increased, as again in the phrase of Raoul Glauber, the earth became clothed in the white robes of churches. This course is about one of the great engineering feats the world has ever known, the building of Europe's Gothic cathedrals. We shall follow the traces of where the ideas and techniques for such innovation might have come from, and we shall trace the history of their spread and evolution. from the first churches of Saint-Denis and Notre-Dame in the Parisian basin, to the cathedrals of Picardy to the north and Normandy to the west, from the first innovations in stone to the delicate house of glass built by Saint Louis in the 1240s, the Sainte-Chapelle, to the flamboyant churches of the late Middle Ages, of which the Cathedral of Milan offers a prime example. We shall assess the fascinating relationship between the cathedrals as a technological and engineering feat and the cathedrals as the centerpiece of religious worship, of social and economic life, and of cultural change. The age of cathedrals was one of the great moments of turning in the West, the equivalent of Greece of the city-state and its monumental Acropolis, or of imperial Rome with its Parthenon. We shall examine what went into building the great high churches of the Middle Ages, and how the churches themselves changed the world around them. We shall look at actual architectural structures, how the buildings were built, who made them and why, from the lowliest haulers of stone and cement to the masons who set stone in place, as we see in this stained-glass image from the Cathedral of Beauvais. Notice in the foreground, porters carrying the construction materials up what looks like a flying buttress, while a mason, his hod in one hand and his trowel in the other, lays regular courses of stone on top. We shall study those who actually made the cathedrals with their hands, and the high church officials, as we see in this manuscript page from the Chronicle of Saint-Denis, who presided over what was a medieval great public works project. Notice the men in the lower left, who are roughing out stone and carving moldings, while the man in the lower right mixes mortar, and his co-worker carries mortar to the mason, who, standing at the top of the scaffolding, combines the cement and stone to complete the cathedral wall. We shall also analyze in some detail the dazzling decoration that is part of every Gothic cathedral, the sculpture in stained glass of the buildings, along with the relics of saints that the cathedrals were meant to house, and which were the source of their spiritual power. We should not forget that in an age when few people could read and manuscript books were rare, the churches, which were covered and filled with images from the Old and New Testaments, served as the Bible of the poor. The age of cathedrals was also the age of the birth of literature in the vernacular tongues, in French, Italian, German, and English, and after long centuries of oral culture, a return of writing to almost every area of human endeavor. We shall read some of the great literary and historical works from the period. In the course of our time together, we shall see what the people who financed, built, and worshipped in cathedrals knew in terms of legends, saints' lives, and miracle stories, heroic poetry, satirical verses, and love poetry, how they communicated with each other via letters, how they represented their own lives in chronicles and autobiography, and yes, how they conducted themselves in the everyday life of medieval towns, much of which went on in the shadow of the cathedral, which dominated the space of the city, and which often could be seen throughout the surrounding countryside. Finally, we shall delve into the history of cathedrals between the time they were built and the present day, keeping in mind that cathedrals are living structures which need to be maintained and preserved, and they have changed both in appearance and in use over the centuries. Where appropriate, we shall point to the legacy of the age of cathedrals in the buildings around us, particularly in the universities, where the Gothic style is still synonymous with intellectual pursuits. This is a course for those who are interested in the Middle Ages, interested in religion, in history, in architecture and art history, in cities and in philosophy and literature. Above all, it is a course for those who are interested in learning more about how what went on some 800 years ago shaped the world that is still recognizably our own. Welcome back to the Age of Cathedrals. In our last time together, we spoke of the high churches of the High Middle Ages as one of the great and magnificent enduring feats of architecture the world has ever known. Today we shall be looking at the very beginning of cathedral building in the Île-de-France or Paris, that is, the Church of Saint-Denis. In the year 1144, Abbot Suger, who was in charge of the Abbey of Saint-Denis, just north of what wasn't yet the capital city, began an extraordinary chronicle which tells the story of the construction of the first Gothic cathedral. Suger was an exceptional figure. Born to humble circumstances, he attended school with the future Louis VI, who ruled as King of the Franks from 1108 to 1137. Suger served as the king's spiritual and political advisor, his ambassador, and eventually his biographer in a work entitled The Deeds of Louis the Fat. Abbot Suger made 4 trips to Rome on behalf of the French king, and in the winter of 1122, returning from a royal mission to Pope Calixtus II in southern Italy, he learned of his predecessor Abbot Adam's death and of his own election to head the monastic community of Saint-Denis. "I was elevated from this dung heap," he wrote, "to sit among princes." Abbot Suger spent the rest of his life between the royal court, which was situated wherever the king found himself, and the cloister. For 4 centuries, Saint-Denis had been the burial place of French kings, beginning with the Frankish leader Dagobert, who died in 639. However, Abbot Suger, a man of exceeding ambition, more for the French king and for the state than for himself, thought the old abbey church was too small, its entrance too narrow, and the space around the main altar too cramped. Dagobert had made his Basilica of the Saints magnificent, rich and full of treasure, he told us. Only one thing was wanting in him, that he did not allow for the size that was necessary. These are Suger's own words, contained in an account of how he transformed the smaller abbey church into a magnificent cathedral. The old cathedral presented what we would call today a security issue, the danger of controlling the crowds that came to worship on feast days. Often on feast days, Suger tells us, completely filled, it disgorged through all its doors the excess of the crowds as they moved in opposite directions, and the outward pressure of the foremost ones not only prevented those attempting to enter from entering, but also expelled those who had already entered. No one could move a foot. No one could do anything but stand like a marble statue, stay benumbed, or, as a last resort, scream. This mid-12th century security issue was also a feminist issue. The distress of the women, Suger writes, was so great that you could see with horror how they squeezed in by the mass of strong men, as in a winepress, exhibited bloodless faces, as in imagined death, how they cried out horribly, as though in labor. Suger's greatest fear was, however, that in all the commotion, the holy relics, and especially the remains of Saint-Denis, might be stolen by visitors who, having no place to turn, might escape with the relics through the windows. Suger's concern for the danger of crowds may be a subtle recognition of a general increase in population in the 12th century. Historians of climate speak of the 10th and 11th centuries as being cold and wet, and of the 12th and 13th centuries as being warmer and drier. More favorable climatic conditions, a mini-global warming, meant that agriculture thrived, and greater crop yields brought a division of labor. With a division of labor came cities. Not everyone had to grow their own food, and those who remained in the countryside might provide for those who lived in town, while those who lived in town might make goods consumed by those who worked the land. Between town and country, we find a wealth of middlemen, entrepreneurs who maintained fairs and markets and transported goods back and forth between the areas of production and the areas of manufacture and consumption. Abbot Suger was a great religious and political leader, but he was also a terrific manager of estates and of money, an expert in such trade. Saint-Denis had been the site of an early Christian settlement in Roman times, the site of economic dealings along trade routes which connected northern Europe with the south. The abbey was founded by Merovingian King Dagobert in the 7th century AD, and Dagobert's tomb, begun in the 13th century, can still be found in Saint-Denis today. Moreover, excavation done by Yale History of Art Professor Sumner McKnight Crosby shows that some of the masonry from the previous church had been used to rebuild the 12th century cathedral. Here we see an image of Merovingian 7th century foundations under the 6th bay of the nave on the north side. The detail of carved ornament on foundational lime blocks and fragments of broken stone indicate that parts of an earlier church were used to build the 12th century cathedral. According to a completely apt medieval proverb, a building torn down is already half rebuilt, meaning that older materials could, as here, be reutilized or repurposed. The Abbey of Saint-Denis was, from the start, exempt from ecclesiastical jurisdiction, and it was richly endowed. As the burial place of French kings, beginning with Charles Martel and his son Pepin the Short in the 8th century, Saint-Denis amassed a huge treasury consisting of the attributes of royal and ecclesiastical office: crowns, scepters, crosses, and other valuable objects that were buried with the 52 kings, 32 queens, and 63 princes and princesses interred there. The bones of the royals were scattered far and wide at the time of the French Revolution, when many cathedrals were vandalized and their treasuries pillaged. These were part of the objects that Suger feared losing amidst the boisterous crowds on feast days. The revolutionaries of 1789, in the heat of the terror of 1793, scattered the wealth of rich objects that belonged to the Abbey of Saint-Denis, some of which ended up eventually in the Louvre Museum and as far away as the National Gallery in Washington and the Walters Museum in Baltimore. The pillaging of the tombs of Saint-Denis is the subject of a painting by Hubert Robert, which depicts vandals disinterring coffins under the nave. The revolutionaries scattered the relics of saints and the bones of the kings and queens of France, which were tossed into two common graves just outside the northern wall of the basilica before they were reburied within the church in 10 joint coffins. Here we see an image of the last king of France, Louis XVI, and Marie Antoinette, in statuary that was replaced in the church at the time of the Revolution of 1830, which also involved the restoration of monarchy. Emperor Charlemagne, who died in 814, was not buried at Saint-Denis, but at his seat of imperial power in Aachen, Germany. He nonetheless offered France as a spiritual fief or possession to Saint-Denis, whose abbot would be the head of the Church of France. For many centuries, Saint-Denis was the chief sanctuary of the land, the place not only of royal burial, but of coronation. Saint-Denis was to be the keeper of the vexillium or oriflamme of Saint-Denis, which is the national emblem, the first flag or banner and symbol of France, supposedly dyed in the blood of the martyr Denis himself. In the founding French national epic, the Song of Roland, the crusading warriors liberating Spain from the Saracen or pagan foe shout, Montjoie, Mount Joy. Charlemagne is with them. Geoffrey d'Anjou carries the oriflamme. It was St. Peter's once and called Romaine, but in that battle it got the name Montjoie. In an age in which longevity is the sign of legitimacy, you can do no better than a flag which goes all the way back to apostolic times and to St. Peter. Here we see a stained glass image from Chartres Cathedral of Saint Denis giving the oriflamme to Jean Clément of Le Metz, Marshal of France, who died around 1260. Saint Denis, and we will get to just who Saint Denis was in a bit, was a national saint, and his church a sacred space that defined the terms of divine kingship until Saint Louis in the 13th century, and even all the way to the Sun King, Louis XIV, in the 17th century. The Abbey of Saint Denis was exempt from ecclesiastical jurisdiction, which meant that it could set its own laws, and it was richly endowed. Charlemagne's grandson, Charles the Bald, confirmed in a charter from the 9th century that income from a certain number of great estates, known as villae, belonged to the monks of Saint Denis, along with all of the slaves or serfs attached to them. However, in the general demographic and economic decline of the 10th and 11th centuries, the economic condition of the abbey also declined. It wasn't until Suger became abbot that the Abbey of Saint Denis began to flourish. Suger was a great reformer and manager of the abbey, a superb administrator with a human touch. Within the church proper, he provided for the comfort of the monks with endowments for their food and provision to keep older monks warm in winter by making their seating in the cold, hard prayer stalls of the choir less harsh. Suger was denounced by that great other church figure of the period, Saint Bernard, who was a great ascetic and who railed against Suger's abbey as a synagogue of Satan, a forge of Vulcan, a military arsenal, and a cave of thieves, because he thought it was too luxurious. Bernard criticized what surely must be Suger, an abbot who travels, he claims, with an armed escort of 60 horsemen. In his tenure as abbot, Suger tripled the revenues of Saint Denis. He did this primarily through revenue from the fair of L'An d'It. The fair of L'An d'It, one of the early signs of economic recovery in the High Middle Ages, was a biannual gathering of merchants who brought goods for sale, tools, food, cloth, and expensive textiles like silks, skins, leather, fur, shoes, and parchment. In this 15th century rendering of the Fair of L'An d'It, we see shoemakers making and selling leather goods at the fair. The man on the far right works on a piece of leather with what looks like a leather tunic spread on the table before him. The man in the middle holds shoe lasts or forms, and the man on the left arranges pairs of shoes for potential clients. Above him hang a pair of high boots, and a third boot graces the merchant's sign on a high pole in the far left quadrant of the image. As we can see in this second 15th century painting, the Fair of L'An d'It drew not only merchants, but moneylenders and even a traveling tavern. In the lower portion, we see a shepherd who has clearly brought what look like pigs to market. In the middle left, we see what look like money changers passing a little pouch from one hand to another, and above them 2 women sitting at stalls, one of whom has a bundle of goods in front of her. Opposite them on the far right, we see a tavern where both a man and a woman are seated, while a servant approaches with 2 glasses and a pitcher of drink, much as in a modern-day café. Above them all presides the bishop, surrounded by monks, recognizable because of their tonsured heads. The bishop collected a percentage on every transaction, just as in today's sales tax. The bishop's part, or tax, was not a gratuitous fee, but payment for guaranteeing the fairness of the proceedings and the safety of the roads to and from market. The term landit comes from the Latin indictus, meaning judgment. From the beginning, then, we see the link between the sacred space of cathedrals, legal judgment, and commerce. In our next time together, we shall see just how Abbot Suger accomplished all that he did in rebuilding Saint-Denis, the first Gothic cathedral. Welcome back to the Age of Cathedrals. In our last time together, we began to explore the first Gothic church, built around the year 1140 in the Île-de-France, just north of Paris, by one of the most remarkable men of the High Middle Ages. Abbot Suger was the man responsible for rebuilding Saint-Denis, a much older church which had fallen into ruins and was too small, and which became the first and the very archetype of a Gothic cathedral. But Suger also built Saint-Denis as a spiritual community, an economic entity, and as the political navel of state-making in 12th century France. Some consider him, which is surely an exaggeration, one of the great architects of all times. On the frieze of the Albert Memorial in London, which was built in 1875, Suger stands between William of Sens, the master mason responsible for the rebuilding of Canterbury Cathedral in the Gothic style about 30 years after Saint-Denis, and Anthemius of Tralles, architect of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. Notice in this image, Suger, whose head is tonsured like a monk, is pictured with his hand upon his chin, indicating that he is a man of thought as well as a builder. What exactly did he build? What did he think? What did he do? Suger was responsible for constructing the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis and for having written a unique account of how he did it, known as On What Was Done Under His Administration. In his account of the building of the first Gothic cathedral, Suger describes a scene of nobles so enthusiastic and dedicated to the project that they take the rings off their fingers and toss valuables and jewels into the mortar. So too is he inscribed in the cathedral, first of all in the writing on the dedicatory plaque of the west facade, which reads as follows: In honor of the church, which nurtured and exalted him, Suger worked, rendering back to you your due, Saint-Denis, martyr. He prays that your prayers will obtain for him a place in paradise. In the year of the word, 1140, the consecration took place. Suger signs his name in the written inscription on the front of the cathedral. Visually, however, he figures in the sculpture of the west facade, on the tympanum, the space above the door, of the central portal, where he sits at the feet of Christ in the scene of the Last Judgment. Since he situates himself by the right foot of Christ, the side of the saved, it is as if Suger were assuring salvation for himself through his good works. There were no architects as such in the Middle Ages. The closest thing to an architect was the master mason, a magister cementarius, or cement master, who might supervise the choice of suitable stone from a quarry, its rough cutting and transportation to the building site, its carving and laying in courses and other patterns as the building went up. The master mason might make drawings upon the floor of the mason's lodge or hut, a shed-like structure erected on the building site, in preparation for the next phase of construction, though few such drawings have survived. The master mason was someone who knew a lot about stone, and there is a lot to know in terms of weight, grain, and color, especially when one sees some of the delicate designs of great Gothic rose windows and arches. Suger was neither an architect nor a master mason, but something on the order of the producer of the first Gothic cathedral, much as one might find a movie producer today, who gathers the resources for making a film, but who hires a director to supervise the actual work. The director might then hire actors, cameramen, costumers, and makeup artists. Abbot Suger did not design the enlarged church at Saint-Denis. He assembled an international team of workers to build the first Gothic cathedral. Bronze founders, jewelers, and enamel workers from the valleys of the Rhine and the Meuse, masons and stone carvers from Normandy, Burgundy, and southwestern France, mosaicists from Italy, and in the abbot's own words, many masters of stained glass from different regions. He was involved personally in locating suitable building materials and made sure that they arrived on site for others to put in place. He was guided by what he terms the concordance and harmony of the ancient and the new work, and he was so anxious to find worthy marble columns that he went so far as to contemplate bringing by ship columns that he had seen in the palace of Diocletian in Rome. They would have traveled through the Mediterranean, the English Channel, and up the Seine, but miraculously, the Almighty led the cathedral builders to the excellent nearby quarry of Pontoise, some 16.5 miles away. Getting the heavy stones to Saint-Denis took a collective effort, as Suger tells us in his memoir of cathedral building. Whenever the columns were hauled from the bottom of the slope with knotted ropes, both our own people and the pious neighbors, nobles and common folk alike, would tie their arms, chests, and shoulders to the ropes, and acting as draft animals, drew the columns up. And on the declivity, in the middle of the town, the diverse craftsmen laid aside the tools of their trade and came out to meet them, offering their own strength against the difficulty of the road, doing homage as much as they could to God and the holy martyrs. This phenomenon of community effort in bringing building materials to the construction site came to be known as the Crusade of the Cathedrals, and as we see here, as well as in the building of Chartres, more than one miracle occurred along the way. In thinking about the construction of the roofwork for his new cathedral, the wooden structure known as the forest above the high vaults, but below the actual roof, Suger learned that adequate beams could be found no closer than the distant district of Auxerre. God, however, again provided. Timber was, against all advice, found in the nearer forest of Yvelines. By the 9th hour, or sooner, we had, Suger tells us, through the thickets, the depths of the forest, and the dense thorn tangles, marked down 12 timbers to the astonishment of all, especially those on the spot. And when they had been carried to the sacred basilica, we had them placed with exultation upon the ceiling of the new structure. Let us think for a minute about the reasons for building Saint-Denis. Were they spiritual or were they worldly? Suger was convinced that he was fulfilling God's mission in building Saint-Denis in the Gothic style, the proof being such miracles as the location of suitable materials and their transport to the construction site. But there were also what we might consider to be material reasons for the reconstruction of the abbey. The old church was too small and it was insecure. Suger worried about the crush of crowds on feast days and about the potential theft of the valuable relics under such chaotic conditions. And there was plenty of reason to be concerned. You will remember from our earlier lecture that the wake of Charlemagne's death of 814 brought to Western Europe a scene of great unrest. Invasions by Scandinavians from the north, Magyars from the east, Arabs from the south, until around the year 1000. History in the centuries of chaos was imagined to be end-stopped, heavily oriented toward the past, with no future in sight. With peace and order, however, came building and a renewal of cultural and intellectual life. Suger participated in the mid-12th century wave of building of churches, and he contributed as well to the renewal of intellectual life in what is sometimes referred to as the Renaissance of the Middle Ages. He upended the sole fixation upon the past through a formula that opens to the future, and what may be the most important sentence of the 12th century. Recollection of the past is the promise of the future, says Suger. Recollection of the past is the promise of the future. In his cathedral, the forward-looking abbot sought to harmonize the old church with the new and to combine the past with the future. The new Abbey of Saint-Denis is a Janus-faced building. It looks back to earlier Romanesque churches, which themselves looked to Rome, and structures like the Arch of Constantine for the all-important entrance on the west facade of the Gothic cathedral. The three portal entrances to both Romanesque and Gothic churches were predicated upon the Arch of Constantine, the arch through which triumphant Roman emperors passed on their way to being received as a divine power. The triple portal entry is, further, one of those architectural designs that can be found elsewhere, like in this entrance to Yale's Hall of Graduate Studies, which is, in some respects, a cathedral of learning. Saint-Denis looks to Rome, which is understandable, since Abbot Suger made 4 trips to the Holy City. But it also looks more mysteriously to pagan symbols from the secular world. We find signs of the zodiac on the north portal jambs of the west facade, the framed friezes that flanked each side of the door. Here, for example, on the upper part of the left jamb, we find the image of Taurus, the bull, and here, just below Taurus, Aries, the ram. Still lower, the astrological sign of Pisces, represented as 2 fish. On the upper part of the right jamb lies Libra with her scales, and below Libra, Scorpio, which along with Pisces is one of the 3 water signs. Finally, below Scorpio, Sagittarius, half horse and half human, the centaur, which is also an archer. On the north portal jambs, we find images that, like the signs of the zodiac, involve the natural cycle of the seasons, the labors of the months, the figure of January, a man with 2 faces, looking forward and backwards, Janus being the etymological root for both January and Janus, door in Latin. September, with 2 men seated on a cask that they are filling, a little lower. November, with a man butchering a pig over a barrel. And at the bottom of the left jamb, a couple sits indoors enjoying a holiday feast in front of the fire, the activity of the month of December. If the cathedral looks to Rome and to the pagan past, it also looks even more deeply to biblical history. The central portal of the west facade of the first Gothic church, like many other such entrances, features the parable of the wise and foolish virgins from the New Testament, Matthew 25, which reads as follows. Then the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 were wise. For when the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. As the bridegroom was delayed, they all became drowsy and slept. But at midnight there was a cry, "Here is the bridegroom, come out to meet him." Then all those virgins rose and trimmed their lamps, and the foolish said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." But the wise answered, saying, "Since there will not be enough for us and for you, go rather to the dealers and buy for yourselves." And while they were going to buy, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the marriage feast, and the door was shut. Afterward the other virgins came also, saying, "Lord, Lord, open to us." But he answered, "Truly I say to you, I do not know you. Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour." We see on the left hand of the door jamb the wise virgins with their vases upturned, full of oil, and on the right the foolish virgins with their empty vessels turned down. The sculptural representation of the wise and foolish virgins offers a good example of how the cathedral is used as a teaching tool, the Bible of the poor who could not read. Here, sculpted on either side of the doorway, we find a great parable about open and shut doors. The moral is, as you enter the house of God, that you never know when the hour of judgment will come. So be prepared. You do not want to be on Christ's left side like the foolish virgins, but on his right side, like those virgins whose vases are ready and full. In our next time together, we shall consider what it means to enter the door of a cathedral, along with the story of Saint-Denis, as it is told over the doors on either side of the central portal of the west facade of France's first Gothic church. Welcome back to the age of cathedrals. The entrance to the Gothic cathedral is a place of great theological truth, and the meaning of the parable of the wise and foolish virgins that we saw in our last time together is continued on the lintels, the linear spaces just above the top of the door, the tympanum, or half circle above the lintels, and the voussoirs, or archivolts, which surround the lintels and tympanum of all 3 doors, which reproduce in 3 dimensions the power of Christ as a door, from the Gospel of John 10:1. "Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that entereth not by the door into the sheepfold, but climbeth up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber. But he that entereth in by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the porter openeth, and the sheep hear his voice. And he calleth his own sheep by name, and leadeth them out. And when he putteth forth his own sheep, he goeth before them, and his sheep follow him, for they know his voice. And a stranger will they not follow, but will flee from him, for they know not the voice of strangers. This parable spake Jesus unto them, but they understood not what things they were which he spake unto them. Then said Jesus unto them again, Verily, verily, I say unto you, I am the door of the sheep. Here we see an image of the central portal of the west facade of Saint-Didier, and here the semicircular portion above the door known as the tympanum, from the Latin word for drum, and which is filled with scenes of Christ's passion, resurrection, and ascension. Above Christ, we see 4 angels, 2 supporting the arms of the cross, and the one just above him holding the crown of thorns. On the upper lintel, Christ is surrounded by the 12 apostles. Immediately to this right, the Virgin with raised hands is clasping a veil. And at either end of the row of apostles, we find angels, the one to our left with a trumpet, and to our right, an angel with a flaming sword, as in Matthew 24:31. Christ says, "And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the 4 winds, from one end of heaven to the other." At Christ's feet, we see naked figures of the dead rising from their tombs. Among them, at the Savior's right foot, the image of Abbot Suger, who can also be seen on the door, apparently at the Last Supper, again at the feet of Christ. The 3 archivolts above Christ's head contain the Trinity, that is, God the Father with head, arms, hands, and feet visible. The rest of his body is covered by the disk he holds, which contains the Lamb, representing Christ and the cross. The dove of the Holy Spirit hovers above both Father and Son, the whole surrounded by 24 elders of the Apocalypse of St. John, seated on thrones and holding harps and golden vials, representing the ultimate state of grace or of damnation at the end of time. The 3 souls in the bosom of Abraham, on the paradise side of the inner archivolt, and the small figure whose hands are in shackles being turned back on the hell side, are drawn from Matthew 8, 11, and 12, where Jesus says that many shall come to heaven from the east and from the west to feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but many will be cast out with weeping and gnashing of teeth. The top angel on the hell side of the archivolt may be casting out one such rejected soul. The scene of Last Judgment upon entering the cathedral is not new to Gothic architecture, but can be found in this spectacular example, the tympanum of the Romanesque pilgrimage church of Saint-Foy in the town of Caen, built in the 11th century in southern France. Here we can see an enormous scene of judgment in which Christ sits at the center at the time of the Last Judgment, the saved to his right and the damned to his left. This sculptural frieze, which still retains elements of the original paint, contains a whole program for the afterlife, as spelled out in the levels of writing, from above Christ's raised hand to the roof of heaven on our left and the roof of hell on the right. On our left and Christ's right, the script reads, "The company of saints stands happy before Christ the Judge. Thus joy is given in heaven to the elect, to those who have conquered, together with glory, peace, rest, and eternal day. Thus stand the chaste, the peaceful, the meek, friends of piety, rejoicing, secure, fearing nothing." On our right and Christ's left, we read just the opposite in the fate of the damned. Perverse men are thus set down to hell. They are tortured, burned in flames, and they tremble at the demons and groan perpetually. Thieves, liars, deceivers, the greedy and rapacious, and criminals, all alike are damned in this way. Under the hole and at the bottom of the tympanum, a long band beneath the whole length of the relief reads, as follows. O sinners, know that unless you change your ways, there will be a hard judgment. And the judgment is hard, indeed, as we see in this detail of the entrance to hell and the devil shoving souls into what was known in the Middle Ages as a hell mouth. To return to Saint Denis, we see that the scenes on the lintel, tympanum, in the first archivolt illustrate the Last Judgment according to the Gospel of Matthew, and are all about the separation of the just from the unjust, the saved from the damned, at the time of the Last Judgment. Matthew 25:32-33. And before him shall be gathered all nations, and he shall separate them one from another, as a shepherd divideth his sheep from his goats. And he shall set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on the left. As we see on the scrolls that unfurled from Christ's hands, to his right side, the inscription reads, Venite benedicti Patris mei, come, O blessed of my Father, based on Matthew 25:34. Then shall the king say unto them on his right hand, Come, ye blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. From his left hand, the inscription from Matthew 25:41 reads, Discedite a me maledicti, depart from me, O cursed. Then shall he say also unto them on the left hand, Depart from me, ye cursed, into everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. Thus we see all on both sides of the entrance to the first Gothic cathedral a drama of preparedness and unreadiness in the parable of the wise and foolish virgins, and above the door a drama of final consequences for moral worthiness and unworthiness in the dead who rise at the end of human time from their tombs and are either cast down the left side of Christ, our right, along the first archivolt above the tympanum into eternal damnation, or the souls that are raised to Christ's right, our left, into eternal salvation. The message couldn't be clearer. Make sure that you are on the right side of the moral equation as you enter the church, which in all its splendor and light offers a foretaste of heaven. The other two portal entrances to the first Gothic cathedral are hardly less interesting. They tell the story of the imprisonment and martyrdom of Saint Denis, the patron saint of the abbey and the patron saint of all of France. We read of the story of Saint Denis in a book written around 1260 by the Italian chronicler and Archbishop of Genoa, Jacques of Voragine. Jacques of Voragine wrote the Golden Legend, which contains the lives of major saints and was one of the most popular books of the Middle Ages. There we read that around the middle of the 3rd century AD, the Roman emperor, who was so enraged at the advances of Christianity in France, that he sent his provost, a judicial officer, Fescinius, to Paris to eliminate the spread of the new religion. There he found Denis preaching, and with two others, Rusticus and Eleutherius. Fescinius had Denis bound in iron and thrown in prison. Denis was denounced by a woman by the name of Laertia, who claimed that he had misled her husband into converting. Fescinius tried to kill Denis by beating, fire, exposure to hungry wild beasts, who became all meek and tame when Denis made the sign of the cross in front of them. Here we see that in prison, Denis celebrates Mass with his fellow prisoners. And as he sang there the Mass and communed the people, our Lord appeared to him with great light and delivered to him bread, saying, Take this, my dear friend, for thy reward is most great with me. Here on the tympanum of the church, the south portal of the west facade, we see Christ descending through the clouds, which are indicated by the wavy lines above Denis' head, to place the wafer of communion directly in the bishop's mouth, as the prisoner on the left holds the cup and the one on the right an open book. On the far left of the inner archivolt, we see Laertia, her hands and body transmitting feelings of regret, maybe remorse, for the deed of denouncing Denis, for which she later repented. On the right, the provost Fescinius seems to be issuing orders, possibly to the two men between Laertia and the prisoners. Two pairs of men, holding swords and an axe, stand on either side of the main scene in the left and right archivolts. In the north portal of the west facade of Saint-Denis, we see the three prisoners, Denis, Rusticus, and Eleutherius, with chains around their necks, being led away by Roman soldiers, holding round shields and broadswords, as Fescinius, again seated to the right of the prison, his arms outstretched, issues the order for their execution. Above the prisoners, Christ, again separated from the earthly realm by clouds, hands the crown of saints to the angels. In the first archivolt on either side, people are lamenting, and at the top we see an angel praying over what appears to be a reliquary, which will house the bones, the sacred relics of the martyrs being led to their death. Finally, on the tympanum above the entrance of the north side of the Cathedral of Saint-Denis, we witness the scene of the beheading of Denis, Rusticus, and Eleutherius, their deaths accompanied by two miracles. At the top, two doves descend to earth, bearing the crown of martyred saints. More famously, Saint-Denis, in the words of Jacques of Voragine, raised himself up and bare his head between his arms, as the angel led him 2 leagues from the place which is said to be the Hill of Martyrs, and which is today the Hill of Montmartre in northern Paris. He led them unto the place where he now resteth. This is the famous miracle of the cephalophoria, walking while carrying one's head, about which the very witty 19th century critic Charles Augustin Sainte-Beuve said, "The first step is the hardest." Saint-Denis carried his head from Montmartre to the place which in the 7th century would become the Abbey of Saint-Denis, and in the 1140s, almost 9 centuries after the miraculous events in Roman Gaul, would be transformed into the first Gothic cathedral. Welcome back to the Age of Cathedrals. In our last times together, we came to know something of Abbot Suger, builder of the first Gothic cathedral, the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis. We saw how rooted Suger and his project were in the Roman, pagan, and biblical past. And though he studied the past, the innovative abbot sought to build something new. The old Romanesque churches he had seen, some of which were the product of an earlier era of cathedral building, had thick walls, few windows, and were dark inside. The Romanesque wall was thick and opaque and covered with painting, as we see in this image of the crypt of Notre-Dame at Étampes, or in this image of the nave of Saint-Sabin-sur-Gartempe, which is painted even on the ceiling with a cycle of stories from the Old Testament. Notice the story of Noah and the ark, looking somewhat like a Viking boat. Romanesque churches had massive walls and few and small windows, as we see in this image of the transept crossing the place where the nave and the choir are intersected by the two transepts at Châtillon-sur-Seine, or in the small windowed crossing at Tournus. Suger's cathedral would have thinner walls, larger windows, and above all, would be filled with light. No one knows exactly who the Saint-Denis was after whom the Abbey Church was named, but Suger put forth a doctrine of light, which was thoroughly in the spirit of one of the possible candidates for the original Saint-Denis, an Eastern theologian and mystical writer known as the Pseudo-Dionysius, or the Pseudo-Denis, a Syrian of late 5th century and author of one of the most important books of the Middle Ages, the Celestial Hierarchies. Remember Suger's famous statement, "Reflection of the past is the promise of the future"? Well, the Celestial Hierarchies was a book that was a fulcrum between the world of late antiquity and the high Middle Ages, between the past and the future. It came to the West through diplomatic exchange between the Byzantine emperor and the Carolingian court. A Greek manuscript containing the works of the Pseudo-Dionysius was given to Charlemagne's grandson, Louis the Pious, by the Byzantine emperor Michael the Stammerer at Compiègne in 827 AD, and from there it came to the treasury of the Royal Abbey of Saint-Denis. Here we see it with its 15th century cover of jewels and ivory, as it can be seen still today in the Louvre Museum. It was unlikely that the writings of Dionysius could be understood in a world in which few people read Greek. There were, however, several translations of the Celestial Hierarchies into Latin, one by a monk by the name of Hilduin, the Bishop of Paris, who died in 840, and another commissioned by Charlemagne's grandson, Charles the Bald, by an Irish monk living in France, John Scott Eriogena, who died in 877 AD. The Celestial Hierarchies was a founding text for Saint-Denis and for the new style of Gothic architecture. In it, God is defined as light. The more light one has, the closer one is to God. The less light, the more one's relation to the divine is mediated by screens. Pseudo-Dionysius elaborates a doctrine of light and illumination, and I quote, "Calling then upon Jesus, the light of the Father, the real, the true, which lighteth every man that cometh into the world, by whom we have access to the Father, the origin of light, let us raise our thought, according to our power, to the illuminations of the most sacred doctrines handed down by the Fathers." We saw in our last time together how important the entrance to the cathedral is, and right over the central entrance of the west facade of Saint-Denis, we find a written inscription that could be right out of the Celestial Hierarchies of Pseudo-Dionysius. The writing above the door reads, "Nobile claret opus, sed opus quad nobile claret, clarificet mentes ut eont per lumina vera." Bright is the noble work, but being nobly bright, the work should brighten the minds so that they may travel through the true lights. The principle which guided Suger in the building of his new cathedral was that of light. His goal, that, in his own words, the whole church would shine with the wonderful and uninterrupted light of most luminous windows, pervading the interior beauty. Once inside the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis, the old thick walls of the Romanesque church with few and small windows were replaced by sheets of colored glass. The Gothic wall is thinner, porous, transparent, not an impenetrable surface to be painted, but full of windows and a source of light. In his account of the building of Saint-Denis, Suger refers to the repainting of the old walls, by which he means the replacement of painted walls by stained glass. Moreover, he says, we cause to be painted by the exquisite hands of many masters from different regions, a splendid variety of new windows, both below and above. Here we see one of the stained glass windows located in the choir of Suger's New-Style church. It depicts a motif found in almost every church built subsequently, and known as the Tree of Jesse, and we shall return to the Tree of Jesse more than once. What is fascinating about this example, however, is that in the lower right quadrant, where often the donor of a window is identified, Suger has placed an image of himself holding a stained glass of the Tree of Jesse, as if he himself were placing it in the new cathedral. Here we see the story of Moses from the Old Testament, and here a window known as the anagogical window, an important word for Suger, as we shall see at the end of our time together today. In building his new church, the first Gothic cathedral, the mastermind behind the project, Abbot Suger, created a building such that the whole would shine with the wonderful and uninterrupted light of most luminous windows. Nor was Abbot Suger timid about describing the objects on which the new light of God would shine in a pervading interior beauty. The abbey glorified in glittering objects and materials. Here we see, in a painting by the master of Saint-Gilles from around 1500, a panel and altarpiece that has since been lost, but which Suger depicts in words in some detail. Into this panel, which stands in front of his most sacred body, we have put, according to our estimate, about 42 marks of gold. Further, a multifarious wealth of precious gems, hyacinths, rubies, sapphires, emeralds, and topazes, and also an array of different large pearls, a wealth as great as we never anticipated to find. You could see how kings, princes, and many outstanding men, following our example, took the rings off their fingers and ordered, out of the love of the holy martyrs, that the gold, stone, and precious pearls of the rings be put into that panel. Suger, cataloging the gems of Saint-Denis, sounds like a miser hoarding his gold, and in a fashion analogous to the miraculous finding of just the right timbers for the roof in the forest of Yvelines, and marvel for the pillars at nearby Pontoise, he describes the remarkable way in which he acquired gems for the new abbey church. When I was in difficulty, he says, for want of gems, and could not sufficiently provide myself with more, for their scarcity makes them very expensive, then, lo and behold, monks from 3 abbeys of 2 orders, that is, from Citeaux and another abbey of the same order, and from Fontevraud, entered our little chamber adjacent to the church and offered us for sale an abundance of gems such as we have not seen in 10 years, hyacinths, sapphires, rubies, emeralds, topazes. Freed from the worry of searching for gems, we thanked God and gave £400 for the lot, though they were worth much more. One of the characteristics of the age of cathedrals is the return of commercial activity. Money began to circulate along with the rise of long and short-range trade routes, markets, fairs, and cities. And Suger's interest in things is partially commercial. He appraises the value of the gems at one amount and the seller at another, neither revealing to the other what that is. The prudent abbot is adept at the art of the deal. Suger was a great collector and restorer of powerful and dazzling objects to fill the treasury of Saint-Denis and to the glory of the cathedral. Here we see drawings of the rich objects that belonged to the Abbey of Saint-Denis before they were scattered and lost at the time of the French Revolution. But not everything was lost, and here we see in the drawing the Abbey's copy of the celestial hierarchies of Pseudo-Dionysius, which ended up in the Louvre, along with one of the most significant objects of state, the throne on which sat the original founder of the abbey in the 7th century A.D., Dagobert's throne, of which Suger speaks in his account of the building of the Cathedral of Saint-Denis. Further, he tells us, we saw to it, both on account of its so exalted function and of the value of the work itself, that the famous throne of the glorious King Dagobert, worn with age and dilapidated, was restored. On it, as ancient tradition relates, the kings of the Franks, after having taken the reins of government, used to sit in order to receive for the first time the homage of the nobles. The throne, as you can see, could use a little upholstery work. Among the liturgical objects that belong to Saint-Denis are a series of precious vases, valuable for their symbolism, their history, and their use in the service of the Mass. Here we see a picture of the famous Juste vase, which Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine acquired on her wedding voyage to the city of Toledo in 1137, and which Eleanor's husband, King Louis VII, presented to the abbey, where it is used at the divine table for libation. It, too, is currently in the Louvre. And here we see a chalice used for Mass at Saint-Denis, and which is now in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. Notice how, in his description of this incredibly gleaming vase, Suger is captured by the play of light upon its glittery surface. We also procured for the services, he tells us, at the altar, a precious chalice out of one solid sardonyx, which word derives from sardius and onyx, in which one stone the sard's red hue, by varying its property, so keenly vies with the blackness of the onyx that one property seems to be bent on trespassing upon the other. Note, too, the resemblance of the image of Christ on the medallion of the vase's base with Eastern images of Christ the Pantocrator, the all-powerful, found on similar vases and on coins from Byzantium. I mention only one more such liturgical object, known as the eagle vase, which is also in the Louvre. And further, Suger tells us, we adapted for the service of the altar, with the aid of gold and silver material, a porphyry vase made admirable by the hand of the sculptor and polisher after it had lain idly in a chest for many years, converting from a flagon into the shape of an eagle. The eagle vase also clearly shows the influence of the East, as can be seen on the eagles on Byzantine silks from the 10th and 11th centuries. Suger was anxious in building the Cathedral of Saint-Denis that it live up to the reputation for richness of the Eastern churches, and he interrogated those who had returned from travels to the Middle East as to whether the things here could claim some value in comparison with those there. By there he meant the church of Hagia Sophia, as well as the palaces in Constantinople, reports of which had returned to Western Europe with participants in the First Crusade, some 40 years earlier. You might wonder, how is it that Abbot Suger's description of the costly, glittery, sumptuous things of this world might square with the traditional Catholic mistrust of the body and of material things, which appeal to the senses, and with at least one strain of medieval thought, which laments, in the phrase of Pope Innocent II, the misery of the human condition? The answer lies, first, in Suger's insistence that the cathedral is the house of God, a threshold to heaven, and a reliquary of sacred, beautiful things. How secluded this place is, he states, how hallowed, how convenient for those celebrating the divine rites, has come to be known to those who serve God there, as though they were already dwelling, in a degree, in heaven while they sacrifice. The answer as to why Suger loved beautiful things lies second in the origin of a new style of architecture. He was a new type of man and a harbinger of what is known, as we saw in our last time together, as the Renaissance of the 12th century. Suger elaborated a new philosophical order. Unlike the early medieval Platonic separation of material and spiritual things, passed to the Middle Ages by St. Augustine, Suger thought it possible to behold sacred reality with bodily eyes. He emphasized not a break, but a continuum between the world of the senses and the higher reality to which the senses on his account were to lead us. And in this, the cathedral is an ideal space for just such an uplift from the material to the spiritual plane. Suger described the actual experience of contemplating the sparkling gems he had amassed in the cross of Saint Eloi, beginning with a quotation from Ezekiel 28:13. He writes, "Every precious stone was thy covering, the sardius, the topaz, and the jasper, the chrysolite, and the onyx, and the beryl, the sapphire, and the carbuncle, and the emerald. Thus, when out of my delight in the beauty of the house of God, the loveliness of the many-colored gems has called me away from external cares, and worthy meditation has induced me to reflect, transferring that which is material to that which is immaterial on the diversity of the sacred virtues, then it seems to me that I see myself dwelling, as it were, in some strange region of the universe, which neither exists entirely in the slime of the earth, nor entirely in the purity of heaven, and that by the grace of God I can be transported from this inferior to a higher world in an anagogical manner." Now, the word anagogic is special, and it belongs to the somewhat complicated world of medieval exegesis, or biblical interpretation. According to many churchmen and even to poets like Dante, there are 4 rules of Scripture by which we can understand difficult things. There's a literal style of understanding for historical purposes. There's a typological level, which connects the Old Testament with the New. Thus, Moses as a liberator can be said to prefigure Christ, as Mary can be said to redeem Eve. Third, there is a tropological level, which has to do with moral meaning, from which right conduct is drawn. And there is an anagogical level, a spiritual understanding by which we comprehend the future and final end of things within the context of God's providence, the divine plan. According to Abbot Suger, we should take note of the pleasure produced in our senses by light, which shines on things that glitter. Such a sensation is not to be rejected, but that which is aesthetically pleasing simply requires some written explanation. He writes, "And because the diversity of the materials such as gold, gems, and pearls is not easily understood by the mute perception of sight without a description, we have seen to it that this work, which is intelligible only to the literate, which shines with the radiance of delightful allegories, be set down in writing." The physicality of the cathedral is a means by which our eyes, provoked by light, lead our minds to contemplation of final things, which Suger calls an anagogical uplifting, and which is also synonymous with words accompanying things. This is made explicit via the extremely unusual survival of the abbot's description of the stained glass windows of Saint-Denis, one of which is known as the anagogical window, and which features St. Paul. One of these, Suger writes, urging us onward from the material to the immaterial, represents the Apostle Paul turning a mill, and the prophets carrying sacks to the mill. The verses of this subject are these: "By working the mill, thou, Paul, takest the flour out of the bran. Thou makest known the inmost meaning of the law of Moses. From so many grains is made the true bread without bran, our and the angels' perpetual food." This will also become the mystic mill that appears in the 14th century in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales in the Reeve's Tale, a tale about a miller. Here we see 2 figures standing on each side of Paul in his mill. To Paul's left, the sinister side, stands a woman representing the synagogue, the Old Testament. And to Paul's right, a woman representing the church, ecclesia, as Paul makes the true bread of the new law by shedding the brand of the old. By working the mill, thou, Paul, takest the flour out of the bran. Thou makest known the inmost meaning of the law of Moses. From so many grains is made the true bread without bran, our and the angels' perpetual food. Suget's words contain an allegorical interpretation of what the eye sees, a making of the invisible visible via words, in the phrase of the Latin author Horace, ut pictura poesis, as is painting, so is poetry. And it is this process that bridges the Old and New Testaments, since by understanding allegorically or anagogically the Old Testament, the truth of the New Testament becomes clear, sometimes expressed as a lifting of the veil, which we have seen in the Pseudo-Dionysius as an ascension towards light, and here a shedding of bran. Also, in the same window, Suget tells us, where the veil is taken off the face of Moses, what Moses veils, the doctrine of Christ unveils. They who despoil Moses bear the law. In another window, where the daughter of Pharaoh finds Moses in the ark, Moses in the ark is that man-child whom the maiden royal, the church, fosters with pious mind. It is interesting to note the detail in this stained glass window of the painting on glass which depicts the child Moses in the ark, or rather this outsized hands and head at the feet of his sister Miriam, the figure on the left in green, and the Pharaoh's daughter beside her. In the same window where the Lord appeared to Moses in the burning bush, Suget writes, just as this bush is seen to burn, yet is not burned, so he who is full of this fire, divine, burns with it, yet is not burned. Also in the same window, where Pharaoh is submerged in the sea with his horsemen, what baptism does to the good, that does to the soldiery of Pharaoh, a like form, but an unlike cause. In the same window, Suget tells us, where Moses receives the law in the mount, we see, after the law has been given to Moses, the grace of Christ invigorates it. Grace giveth life, the letter killeth. Notice that the image of Moses receiving the old law at Mount Sinai is surrounded by important scenes from the Exodus story. Already in the center rondo, as Moses lifts his hands up to receive the tablets, there is a hint of the golden calf in the lower quadrant. In the half rondel on the right, below, we see the Hebrews worshiping the golden calf. To the left, Moses smashes the tablets in anger. On the upper right, the hand of God slays those who still worship the golden calf. And on the upper left, Moses finds himself on Mount Nebo, the place of his death, as God at the very top of the half rondo emerges from a wavy cloud, the iconic sign of heaven to point the way to the promised land. Led by a prominent churchman of the 12th century, who also happened to be the mastermind of the rebuilt Abbey Church of Saint-Denis, we catch a glimpse of how the Gothic cathedral functioned as a spiritual teaching tool for those who entered there, which is the subject of our next time together. Welcome back to the Age of Cathedrals. In our last time together, we encountered some of the ideas that led to the extraordinary architectural achievement of the first Gothic cathedral, beginning in the 1140s in what is now a northern suburb of Paris, Saint-Denis. We saw how the Abbot Suget conceived of a new space that would give structural expression to the doctrine of light contained in a book that had belonged to the Abbey since the 9th century, the celestial hierarchies of the Pseudo-Dionysius, who equated God with light. And we saw how this ancient and new doctrine of light was incorporated into stained glass windows, which were meant to provoke a spiritual uplifting toward the physical light, as well as the light of spiritual understanding. Today we shall look at the Romanesque churches that preceded Gothic building, and we shall go on to lay out the basic characteristics of the Gothic style that took root in the cathedrals of the 12th and 13th centuries and that have been around ever since. The Romanesque style of architecture emanated from the great period of defensive retreat into the countryside after the collapse of the Carolingian Empire in the 9th century. And Romanesque churches often seem like defensive fortresses. What is most immediately striking is the stocky frontality of the building, the illusion of a massive defensive impenetrability. The church as a projection of the military castle, like the castle of Loches from the first quarter of the 11th century. Here we see an example of the fortress church in Notre-Dame of Toulouse, or Saint-Sernin, also in the southern city of Toulouse, or Poitiers Cathedral in the central region of France, along the pilgrimage route from Paris to Saint-Jacques of Compostela in Spain. Though the Romanesque is primarily a southern phenomenon, it is not limited to the south, as we see in this prime example of Norman church building, the Abbey Church of Jumièges, begun around 20 years before Duke William of Normandy's conquest of England in 1066. We have spoken of the massively thick walls of Romanesque churches, whose opaque inner surfaces are covered with paint. On the outside, Romanesque churches tend to be decorated with low-relief carvings, which are part of the structure of the building, and which were, at the outset, highly naturalistic. That is to say, they contained vegetable designs. Here we see the west portal of Saintes, or the trumeau, which is the post of the central portal of a west facade, of Souillac. Often, alongside the plants of the naturalistic Romanesque scroll and vinework, we find an intense mixture of sacred and profane elements in Romanesque sculpture, such as in these Chauvigny capital friezes with demons. The massive Romanesque wall is thick for a reason, which has to do with its function. The walls support the whole weight of the vault and roof, with slight reinforcement of pillars set along the wall, but no external system of buttressing to resist the lateral thrust of the upper arches. Lateral thrust is the force that moves vertically at the top of an arch or horizontally at the place where the vault meets the vertical walls. We observe the lack of external buttressing in this image of the Abbey Church of Saint-Benoît-sur-Loire, or the Church of Saint-Savin-sur-Gartempe in Vienne. In Romanesque churches, the problem of lateral thrust is dealt with from the inside, as we see in this cross-section of the Church of Conques. What we see from the outside is a series of radiating chapels in the eastern part, or chevet, which will become the choir of Gothic cathedrals. There are no external buttresses in Romanesque churches to carry the weight of high walls to the ground. The church reaches the height that it does through an internal system of vaults posed on top of each other, as in the outside of Conques. The vaults used in Romanesque cathedrals are sometimes referred to as tunnel or barrel vaults, as we see at the top of the Abbey Church of Vézelay, or they're sometimes called groin vaults, a style which survives in the arches of some of the Yale buildings, as in this example of an arch in the Hall of Graduate Studies. As its name implies, Romanesque churches are oriented towards Rome, but they are also local, and their particular shape reflects regional styles. There is a Norman and Burgundian Romanesque, and Romanesque from the region of the Loire. And it is a rural phenomenon as well. Romanesque architecture was nurtured in monasteries, among those wishing protection from the savage world, or to escape what the early church fathers termed the noise of the cities, social, commercial, and secular life. And Romanesque churches grew also along the pilgrimage routes between northern Europe and Saint-Jacques of Compostela in Spain, at Vézelay, at Conques, at Toulouse, and Paris le Monial. The radiating chapels of Romanesque churches fulfill the dual function of supporting the upper arches and providing a space in which regular parish members might pray in the central nave or around the altar, while pilgrims could circulate and worship in the chapels around the central portion of the cathedral. Gothic cathedrals, unlike Romanesque, are an urban phenomenon, an opening to a wider world, part of nation building in 12th century France, about which we will have more to say later. But Gothic was also an international style. We find Gothic cathedrals in England, Italy, Spain, Germany, the Lowlands, even Central Europe and Scandinavia, but primarily in France. And in France, primarily in the Île-de-France, the Parisian basin. The great art historian Henri Faucillon wrote that Gothic is the Romanesque of the Île-de-France. The Gothic style is associated with some 80 cathedrals and almost 500 abbeys, estimated to have been built in France between 1180 and 1279. Some were built quickly, as in the examples of Auxerre, Coutances, Le Mans, in 4 decades or less. Glastonbury Abbey in England took only 17 years to build. Canterbury Cathedral took 343 years. Amiens, Beauvais, Bourges, Évreux, Lyon, Rouen took more than 300 years. Bristol Cathedral in England was begun in 1218 and completed only in 1905, for a duration of 688 years. On average, 250 to 300 years represented the time it took to build a Gothic cathedral. Remember that the building season was restricted by temperature. In northern climates, you could not build in the winter when cement would freeze. This was the time in which stone workers and sculptors might work on shaping and carving stone to go up on the sculptural portions of the cathedral in the mason's shed. The term Gothic is vexed, and every so often someone suggests replacing it with something like the modern style, or abolishing the term altogether. Gothic refers to an architectural style or a style of Gothic lettering used in Germany until the 20th century. Gothic is associated with Germany in the north because of the Germanic tribes, the Vandals and the Goths and the Visigoths, which swept across Europe in the 4th to 6th centuries AD. The term is the equivalent of barbarism and eventually of mixed or bad taste. Most recently, goth or grunge has been used to designate young people with pierced soft tissue and cartilage, dangling chains, studded necklaces, black clothes, a bad attitude, and flying buttresses in their hair. At the time of the Renaissance of the 16th century, the French writer François Rabelais refers to the Middle Ages as the time of the Goths. The term really was first used, however, with Romanticism in the 19th century, and it was related to trees. Goethe likens cathedrals to the trees of God, which repeats an earlier trope of Italian Renaissance humanists. The painter Raphael famously remarked around the year 1519, "This architecture of the Germans did make some sense, however, as it was derived from trees, not yet cut down, but whose branches were bent over and made to form pointed arches when tied together." Moving now from the origin of the word to the structure itself, let's look at the basic parts of a Gothic cathedral, beginning with the crypt. The crypt is usually the oldest part of the cathedral and is like an underground chapel, though the crypt, as in this image of Saint-Denis, might contain windows. The word comes from the Greek kryptein, to hide, and the space is used for burial. And as the most secure part of the church, it was also used to house precious relics. Remember Abbot Suger's anxiety, his concern that the relics of Saint Denis be kept safe from the crowds on holy days when the cathedral might be overcrowded? Above the crypt, we find the apse, that rounded easternmost part of the cathedral, which may be surrounded by radiating chapels, and the choir, which stands between the altar and the apse, which together make up the short part of the vertical vector of the cross, as is clear in this diagram of Chartres Cathedral. Here we see a picture of the choir and the apse of Saint Denis, and in this cross-section we see the relation of the crypt to the choir. On the western side of the altar lies the nave, a word which comes from the Latin navus, meaning boat. The nave is the place where parishioners worshipped, the nave being separated from the altar and the choir by a choir screen. Members of the clergy would have worshipped on the choir side of such a barrier, while ordinary people, the community of the faithful, would have stood in the nave. Many of the medieval choir screens have disappeared, destroyed by the energy of revolutionaries intent upon removing barriers of difference between the clergy and even high church officials and the common people. Here, however, we see a drawing of the choir screen that once stood in Notre Dame in Paris. The cathedral is built in the form of a cross. The vertical section, consisting of the apse and the choir in the east and the nave west of the altar, is crossed by two northern and southern arms of the transept, which at its point of coincidence is known as the transept crossing. All around the nave, the transepts and the choir, we find either a single or a double vaulted passageway, known as the side aisles around the nave, and the ambulatory around the choir and apse. The ambulatory permits the circulation of people on and around the radius of the cathedral. And if any of you have ever been to Notre Dame in Paris or another cathedral while Mass is being conducted, you recognize that you can, like a medieval pilgrim, still make the tour of the out edge of the inside of the building without interrupting the religious service. We have already encountered some of the important changes from Romanesque to Gothic churches. We have, for example, seen how gracefully tall the new buildings are, how the massively thick Romanesque walls with few windows are replaced by thinner Gothic walls containing stained glass, which create the effect not only of lightness, but of the light which is, in the thinking of the builders of the high Gothic cathedrals, the equivalent of godliness. In reaching such heavenly heights, we can distinguish four distinct levels. Not all four are always there, but when they are, these are the four seen in this photo of the Cathedral of Laon, from the south side of the choir and the south transept from the crossing. We see the main arcade on the bottom level, and above the main arcade, the tribunes, above the tribunes, the triforium, and on the very top, the clerestory windows. Gothic sculpture departs from the naturalistic scroll and vinework carved in bas-relief on Romanesque arches, and seems to stand not only in much higher relief, but to be detached from the surface of the structure, as in this example of the central portal of the west facade of Chartres. Notice how what were known as the jam statues, as well as the carvings on and all around the tympanum, stand freely on their own against the columns and the arches to which they are attached. It is as if they had been carved elsewhere and then put in place. This is especially true if we compare the Gothic figural carving of Chartres with the decorative Romanesque designs around the arched entrance to the church of Aulnay. Indeed, one of the stained glass donor windows, that of the masons at Chartres, shows the carving of just such a figure, from the rough hewing of stone on the left to the detail work on the right. Gothic sculpture and building are combined in something unthinkable in the Romanesque fortress churches, that is, the delicate tracery work, which turns parts of an entire building into some version of a work of sculpture, as in this example of the south portal of Notre Dame. Tracery reaches its pinnacle in Strasbourg Cathedral from the late 13th century. Note, too, that tracery still survives as a style even in American Neo-Gothic, as in this example of Yale's Harkness Tower, or the entrance to Stirling Library. Gothic cathedrals are covered in sculpture of the most varied types, like these capital friezes of Chartres, the towers of Laon, with their impressive figures of oxen at the top in homage to the beasts of burden which haul the stone to build the cathedral, to the gargoyles of Notre Dame, or what were known as the dado or stamped figures on the south side of Notre Dame, and which supposedly depict scenes of student life in Paris's medieval student or Latin quarter. We will return to these different types of sculpture in the course of our next time together. What we should keep in mind from today's lesson is that while Romanesque churches seem heavy and inert, Gothic cathedrals are busy and active, full of visual and perspectival energy. It is not an exaggeration to speak of the optical relativism of Gothic versus the stolid set quality of Romanesque. What one sees in a Gothic church is a function of where one is situated relative to a field of vision. Optically, Romanesque churches are frontal, whereas Gothic cathedrals are organized along a much more complex visual plane. Romanesque style establishes boundaries, while the Gothic church abolishes them. And looking at Romanesque churches, one is either outside or inside. Gothic structures move from outside in, and once inside, they embrace the viewer as they seem to come forward from the core of the wall in continuous recession, as we can see in this image looking into the arcade and tribunes of Notre Dame in Paris. The overall effect of Gothic is not seizable by the eye in a single moment from a single perspective, but seems to consist of a series of overlapping planes such that what one sees is a function of where one is standing in relation to the myriad of visual possibilities. In our next time together, we shall examine in greater detail some of the technical breakthroughs that went into Gothic cathedral building. Welcome back to the age of cathedrals. In our last time together, we looked at the basic elements of medieval church building: the crypt, the apse and choir, the nave, the transepts and the transept crossing, as well as some of the architectural innovations of Gothic cathedrals, the thinner walls and replacement of painted interior spaces by stained glass, the overall effect of dazzling height, reaching toward the light, the various types of detached sculpture, the delicate effects of tracery, and the dynamic optical impression of complex and energetic exterior and interior spaces. Today we will address some of the technical issues connected to Gothic buildings in order to ask the question, how was it that the master masons who built Gothic cathedrals managed to build such large and tall structures, and at the same time to make them appear so graceful and so delicate? The first technical innovation of Gothic architecture had to do with the reinforcement of the shafts which support the high, wide ceiling vaults. Some of the pillars under cathedral walls are massively thick, as in this example from Notre Dame in Paris. Notice how massive the pillars are on either side of the nave. Other columns, however, are rendered less obviously massive by the use of what are known as composite piers, shafts, half columns, or pilaster strips, which surround a main shaft up to the level of the capital or abacus, from which the large vault might be sprung. Here we see examples of a compound pier in the entrance to the nave of Saint-Denis. And here are some early examples from France and England of piers with detached shafts. The free shafts are here pictured in black, the core of the pillar in hatching. The high and wide vaults themselves were reinforced by a system of ribs, which are designed to transfer the weight of the ceiling to precise points and along distinct lines to the top of the columns, which then transfer it internally to the ground. Scholars have debated long and hard about whether the rib is an aesthetic or a functional element of the structure. Yet there is no doubt that the ribbed vault replaced the barrel or tunnel and groined vaults as an essential element of Gothic design. Here, looking up the choir vault of Notre Dame in Paris, we see the new crisscrossed and mutually reinforced system of Gothic ribbing, a feature of style which survives as a style, as in these examples of ribbed vaulting along the ceiling of one of the Yale colleges, even when it is not structurally necessary. The overall structure of Gothic cathedrals was further enhanced by use of broken or pointed arches, as in this example of the west facade of Notre Dame in Paris, or again in this New World rendering on Harkness Bell Tower at Yale. Broken arches, it turns out, tend to be 25 to 30% stronger than the Romanesque rounded arches, or the basket handle arches, which tended over time to sag in the middle, as in this example from Vézelay. Above all, Gothic church architecture is associated with an externalizing of support for its high walls, and this via the flying buttresses which unite the inside and outside of the building in an organic whole, as we can see in this example from the choir of Saint-Denis, but which will be more spectacularly realized in, say, Reims, as we see in this image of the exterior of the apse and choir, at Le Mans, at Beauvais, at Chartres, where the flying buttresses make for an incredible sense of structural lightness. This fine example of high Gothic style is angled and denies the Romanesque defensive, stolid, square frontality. If Romanesque building is about mass and weight, Gothic building is about vectors and forces. In this cross-sectional drawing of a flying buttress by the man responsible for the restoration of Gothic cathedrals in the 19th century, Eugène Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc, we see just how the Gothic buttressing system parries the lateral thrust of the high vault to the ground. The buttress structure is energetic, complex, multi-layered, moving along horizontal and vertical lines, but also diagonally. The use of a tangle of shapes, straight lines, rounded and pointed arches, triangles, squares, rectangles, trapezoids, reveals a space that is both inside and outside of the building, visible to the eye and not. The blue line on our side separates the inside and the outside of the building, with the image of the man dwarfed by the height of the tribune. Dynamic and intricate, the great Gothic wall is not about weight, but about forces. Forces opposed to each other, acting counter to each other, held in balance with each other, to produce a third in counterpoise, which is neither. This takes place where the lateral thrust of the rib ogival vault meets the counter thrust of the flyer, which is the red line. The flyer carries that force to the external medial vertical pier, where it is again met at the optimal point before being transferred to the massive outer buttress, and from there to the ground. Note the use of the pinnacle weight placed on top of the middle vertical pier to stabilize it and to prevent movement and tension in the pier buttress. The upper flyers also function to resist the effects of high winds pressing on the large exposed surface of the clerestory wall and roof at higher elevations, while the lower supports resist the lateral thrust of the vault. Finally, the cathedral builders of the 12th and 13th centuries were able to build as big and high as they did through the use of a bay pattern of construction in modules, as we see in this reconstruction of the original plan of Notre Dame of Laon Cathedral, or of the Cathedral of Sens, or of Chartres. Gothic architecture is synonymous with multiplicity, modular accretion, a grid system, a network, a repetitive all-over pattern. The division of the nave into successive identical units, bays with analytic partitions, each reinforcing the one next to it, meant that the bigger a building was, the stronger it was. This quality of regular modules that can be substituted for each other has also led to the comparison of Gothic architecture with scholastic philosophy, which seeks to find in logic a language into which ideas can be inserted and substituted for one another. Art historian Gottfried Semper remarked that Gothic architecture is scholasticism in stone, an idea most fully elaborated in a book by Erwin Panofsky, Gothic Architecture and Scholastic Philosophy. Gothic architecture was certainly linked to the new science and learning of the period, which we will see most dramatically when we get to our discussion of Chartres, one of the new centers of learning in the 12th and 13th century. Before we end today, however, I would like to share with you an astounding fact. The cathedrals were built without measuring materials. It was all done via proportion. This tomb slab of Hugh Libergier, who died in 1263, and who in 1231 began the construction of the Abbey of Saint-Nicaise in Reims, shows the master builder with a rod, which is not a measuring stick, but was used like a compass to lay out ratios. The great builders thought of themselves as geometricians. Suger claims that Saint-Denis will shine with the beauty of length and width. Moreover, he says, it was cunningly provided that though the upper columns and central arches, which were to be placed upon the lower ones built in the crypt, the central nave of the old nave, should be equalized by means of geometrical and arithmetical instruments with the central nave of the new edition. Here, the influence of Arabic science and mathematics is undeniable. The Arabs had vast knowledge of classical and Indian science. Filtered through the universities of Spain, such knowledge reached France in the 12th century. Adelard of Bath translated the complete works of Euclid at a time when only a few theorems were known in Western Europe. In 1145, Robert Chester translated Al-Khwarizmi's work on algebra, which marked the arrival of the calculating methods of algebra in Europe. In a famous incident in architectural history, the builders of the Cathedral of Milan ran into difficulty and summoned great architects from all over the world in 1391 or 1392. Records of their discussions survive, and they show that there was no contest over the importance of geometric forms in plotting the future design of the cathedral. There was merely debate over whether to use the square, on which the ground plan had already been built, or the equilateral triangle. In their proportionally geometric layout, Gothic cathedrals were assumed to embody divine proportions along the lines that God revealed to Noah for the building of the ark, or to Moses for the building of the Ark of the Covenant, or the proportions revealed to Solomon for the building of the first temple. So too do such proportions have a relation to music and to musical ratios, and this via the concept of Platonic number symbolism. For Augustine, numbers are the thoughts of God. All embodied things exist in proportion and number, he says, and Augustine's perfect ratio, 1 to 2, or the octave, is generally thought to determine a cathedral's elevation, or the relation between the length of the church and the total width of the transept. As we have seen, architecture had an anagogical function, that is to say, to be spiritually uplifting and to provoke movement toward the spiritual world. And it had the purpose of embodying proportion among numbers, with the understanding that the perception of ratios embodies reason and leads to God in his sanctuary, the heavenly city. Numbers guide the mind from perception of things to an invisible truth in God, who is pictured as the architect of the universe, as seen in this miniature from a mid-13th century French Bible. In our next time together, we shall examine the building of what is perhaps the best-known Gothic cathedral, Notre Dame in Paris. Welcome back to the Age of Cathedrals. In our last time together, we examined some of the technical innovations that went into the great High Gothic cathedrals, and which must have involved not only calculation according to the new techniques of geometry recently arrived in Western Europe, but a good deal of experimentation as well. With Notre Dame in Paris, however, the Gothic style can no longer be said to be experimental, but to have hit its stride. The cathedral was at the center of the city building of the 12th and 13th centuries, and all around it, it transformed every area of economic, legal, social, intellectual, and cultural life. These are the centuries not only of building, tall churches in stone, but of writing, in which the written word comes to dominate many activities that since the fall of the Carolingian Empire had been conducted without it, or not at all. One thinks of the fixing of courts and of government in Paris, the establishment of the Parliament in the Royal Palace, which was not yet in the Louvre, but located next to the site of the present-day Sainte-Chapelle. Cathedrals were an important part of state building in the High Middle Ages, and the Cathedral of Paris, in competition with Saint-Denis, was to become the center of the Church of France. Napoleon had himself crowned emperor there. Notre Dame is used daily still for Mass and for special liturgical occasions, like the ordination of priests, here seen lying face down on the floor. The French nation gathered in Notre Dame after the liberation of Paris in 1944, and to mourn the victims of the Air France disaster in 2009. In the Middle Ages, Notre Dame was at the center of the emerging capital, next to the seat of government, but also next to markets and law courts, in a relation, as we saw in Saint-Denis, between commerce and faith. Here we see, in another example from Reims, the image of a cloth merchant who has cheated a customer, being brought before the bishop to face the legal consequences of his misdeed. Though the narrative sculpture was damaged at the time of the French Revolution, we can still identify a first scene in which the merchant is dealing with a customer, with a hint of cheating suggested by what appears to be a boy hiding under the table on which the merchant's wares have been spread out. In a second scene, the dishonest merchant is apprehended, as we glean from the hands of the large figure which seizes those of the cheater. Finally, the perpetrator is brought before what appears to be a statue of the Virgin, with a child on her lap, surrounded by ecclesiastical authorities. In addition to being a commercial center alongside Reims, cathedral towns were places of intellectual innovation. The University of Paris sprouted on Mount Sainte-Geneviève, the hill just to the south of the Cathedral of Notre Dame, in Paris's Latin Quarter or left bank. We should keep in mind that today's cathedral is not the 12th or even the 13th century building. Cathedrals were built in stages, sometimes referred to as programs. And in the building of Notre Dame in Paris, the first matter at hand involved demolishing a series of buildings that had grown on the site between the 4th and the 11th centuries. These included a church dedicated to Saint Stephen and another dedicated to the Virgin from before the 9th century. In a first building campaign then, between 1163 and 1182, materials were gathered from nearby stone quarries and forests belonging to the bishop and hauled to the site either overland or by boat to the quays along the Seine. The gathering of building materials was accompanied by an assembling of workers, carters and haulers, of course, and mortar men, masons, stonecutters, carpenters, roofers, ironworkers, all under the supervision not of an architect in the modern sense, but of a master builder, a head mason, referred to in documents as a magister cementarius, a master cement man. The easternmost part of the choir, the chevet, was laid out according to a series of concentric circles from a fixed compass point. Smaller circles marked the placement of internal columns, and the diameter of the largest circle determined the diagonal sides of an isosceles triangle whose uppermost point demarcated the height of the roof vault. Then a foundation was dug and filled with extremely hard stones, capped with some of the masonry recycled from the churches torn down on the spot, in keeping with the medieval proverb, "A building destroyed is already half rebuilt." Here we see what the choir and the chevet might have looked like around the year 1170. And here is what it looks like outside from the south today. In a period of about 10 years, the flying buttresses and roof had been put into place for this most eastern part of the church. Once the roof, with its elaborate forest of beams, had been closed, it served as a scaffolding for the erection of the curved vaults that we now see when we look up at the ceiling of Notre Dame in Paris. The vaults in place, the high altar of Paris's central cathedral was consecrated by a legate of the Pope on May 19, 1182, and services began to be conducted there by the bishop and the canons, who lived on the north side of Notre Dame and were responsible for maintaining the daily liturgy, which was not yet open to the public. In a second and a third building campaign, which lasted from 1180 to 1220, the transepts, which corresponded to the two branches of the cross, stretching to the north and to the south along the east-west axis of the cathedral, were completed. Using many of the same techniques for the construction of the choir, the building of the nave extended to the west, terminating in the base of the west façade, by which we still enter Notre Dame today. By 1220, the Cathedral of Notre Dame was essentially complete, with the exception of the towers atop the western façade. The last initial campaign in the building of Notre Dame, which lasted from 1225 to 1250, saw the erection of the towers at the northern and southern sides of the west façade, along with the high gallery between the two towers, known as the Gallery of Kings. Now, a cathedral is a living organism, and renovation of Notre Dame began even before the church was completed, as new construction and renovation went on hand in hand for some time. In their initial construction, the flying buttresses of the nave, unlike the reinforcing wall of the choir, which aligned with the outside wall too far beneath the springing of the arches of the high vault, originally were of the double type, with the lower flyer placed beneath the roof of the tribunes. The buttresses were altered, however, beginning in 1225 to 30, by an increase in the size of the upper windows and a lowering of the roof angle of the tribunes, replacing the double with single flyers. We know this because of the archaeological observations of the great renovator of France's cathedrals, Eugène Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc, who found the traces of 5-spoked rose windows on the tribune levels, windows that were later enlarged to the elongated lancet type. Note the difference in the window arrangement of the transept crossing and the nave. Here is the type of window arrangement, lancet and ocular, before 1225, and there we see the arrangement after 1225. In the 13th century, chapels opening upon the ambulatory were constructed between the contreforts, that is, between the reinforcing vertical piers of the nave. The original spire was added, gargoyles appeared for the first time in the 1230s. Note that these are not the elaborate fantasy-like gargoyles designed by Viollet-le-Duc and put into place in the 19th century, as seen in this beautiful photo of a stormy Paris sky. No one knows exactly what functions gargoyle serves. Were they intended to keep evil spirits away? Were they meant to scare worshippers as they entered the cathedral? The gargoyles remained, however, a constant source of fascination, as we see in this image of Yale's Harkness Tower, built in the 1920s. To return to Notre Dame, Jean Ravis, master architect of Notre Dame from 1318 to 1344, completed the radiating chapels as well as the tribune windows and single flying buttresses on the northern side. Notre Dame has evolved through the centuries. In the 17th century, Louis XIV faced the interior of the choir with marble neoclassical columns, as we see again in David's coronation of Napoleon. The end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century was a period of great transformation and destruction of France's cathedrals. Architect of the Pantheon, Jacques-Germain Soufflot, received instructions from the government to enlarge the main entrance, and he destroyed the trumeau, the post in the central door of Notre Dame's west façade, in order to accommodate large public processions. Here we see what the central entrance of the west façade looked like before 1771. The French Revolution of 1789 saw massive destruction and pillaging. The gallery of Old Testament kings and prophets of the west façade were mistaken for the kings of France and were removed, along with the original jam statues on either side of the doors. Some have turned up here and there, the latest in 1977 during excavation for a bank building in northern Paris. They now reside in Paris's Museum of the Middle Ages, or Cluny Museum. At the time of the Revolution, the interior of Notre Dame was sacked with the loss of many objects, like this choir screen. The Revolution of 1830 saw another pillaging of Notre Dame, especially the sacristy, which was burned to the ground. But most of all, Notre Dame was changed by the restoration undertaken between 1843 and the end of the 1850s by Eugène Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc, who attempted to restore the cathedral to its medieval or original state. Viollet-le-Duc rebuilt the flying buttresses, restored statuary on the façade, gargoyles and stained glass. He removed neoclassical touches inside and rebuilt the roof, and especially the gutter system, along with the spire. Medieval cathedrals were painted on the inside, and Viollet developed a series of polychrome patterns that were part of his restoration. But Viollet-le-Duc was not shy in his restoration of the cathedral, and here we can see several instances of his leaving his signature upon the restored medieval monument. We see his image as one of the apostles on the roof, holding the architect's square, and here, on the north entrance of the west façade, he casts himself in the role of Adam in this depiction at the base of the trumeau on which the Virgin holds the child in a scene of the fall. Violet's restoration of Notre Dame was part of a great return to the Middle Ages after the French Revolution of 1789. The revolution was kind neither to the French king's identification with the classical past, the neoclassical aspirations of the Ancien Régime, nor with the medieval alliance between church and crown. Between 1789 and 1793, revolutionaries sacked and pillaged France's cathedrals, and for the first decade of the 19th century, churches were neglected, falling into disrepair. The restoration of monarchy, however, after the exile of Napoleon I in 1815, brought with it a return of interest in the Middle Ages as part of the great wave of nationalism and focus upon the indigenous past, one component of which was the discovery of medieval architectural, historical, and literary monuments, along with medieval languages and literary and historical texts. In our next time together, we shall explore the varied and intricate sculptural programs on the outside of Notre Dame in Paris. Welcome back to the Age of Cathedrals. In our last time together, we began to look at the Church of Notre Dame in Paris. Notre Dame is a Janus-faced building. It looks back to Saint-Denis and even to some of the buildings of Normandy, like this Abbey Church of Saint-Étienne in Caen from the 11th century, or the Abbey of Jumièges with their double towers and bridge. But Notre Dame is also a watershed in the development of Gothic architecture, and it presents several startling features that will be part of the cathedrals built from then on. What is new in Notre Dame? Well, first of all, Notre Dame is identifiable with the names of particular architects and master builders. And first among these, Bishop of Paris Maurice de Sully, who began building in 1163 and who died in 1196, leaving £100 for the completion of the roof. Maurice's successor, Eudes de Sully, began the west facade of Notre Dame between 1197 and 1208. Guillaume de Seignelay continued the work between 1219 and 1224. Guillaume d'Auvergne supervised the installation of the large bell named appropriately the Bishop between 1228 and 1249. The names of Jean de Chelles and Pierre de Montreuil are associated with the building of Notre Dame in the 13th century, as are the names of Pierre de Chelles, Jean Ravi, and Jean Le Boutellier in the 14th. Second innovation at Notre Dame are the flying buttresses, a move whose radical nature cannot be overstated. As we have seen, the walls of Romanesque churches were massive and had to be thick to deal with the lateral thrust of the ogival vault. Support for height was achieved from inside, from strutting over and around the tribunal. The flying buttresses of Notre Dame, however, stood outside the high walls of the choir and were perpendicular to it, but only seeming to hold it up. This wall was higher and lighter than any built before, and it transformed the old Romanesque question of weight and mass, of horizontal lintels stretched across vertical columns, into one of energy, force, thrust, and counterthrust, as its intricate parts with diverse functions bore the weight of the great ogival vaults through a series of structural parries to the ground. A third innovation associated with Gothic has to do with the sculptural programs all around the cathedral, but especially all across and up and down the western facade. These are not inaccessible, but are meant to be seen, studied, taken in. Again, the entrance to the Gothic cathedral is key. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved, we read in John 10:9. The west facade of Notre Dame is a multi-layered visual field in which we can identify various zones, programs, and sculptural media, from the high gallery of kings to the trumeau in each doorway, to the statue jam figures flanking each door, to the dado reliefs below the jam figures, to the lintels above the doors, and the tympana with their surrounding archivolts or voussoirs. What is known as the Sainte Anne portal lies on the south lateral section of the west facade. We begin with the trumeau, which features Saint Marcel. Saint Marcel was a 5th century saint who did not die as a martyr, but who, according to legend, vanquished with a blow of his crosier, which he holds in his left hand, a dragon which was terrorizing the prostitutes of Paris. Each of the triangular tympana above the doors of the west facade tells a story. The southern entrance contains the story of the conception of Anne, Mary's mother, the birth of Mary and of Christ. It is one of the key elements of the genealogical bent of the west facade, which features Christ's royal genealogy, which includes Solomon and David, along with 26 princely ancestors mentioned by Matthew and are found in the Gallery of Kings. The portal contains the story of the conception of Anne, Mary's mother, the birth of Mary, and of Christ. This frieze of the conception of the Virgin is staged as a play in sculpture, which takes place before the birth of Christ. According to the golden legend of the 13th century chronicler and Archbishop of Genoa, Jacques of Voragine, Anne and Joachim had been married for 20 years, yet remained childless. Joachim, he writes, who was of Galilee, of the city of Nazareth, espoused Saint Anne of Bethlehem, and they were both just and without reproach or reprehension in the commandments of our Lord. And they divided all their substance in 3 parts. One part was for the temple, the other they gave to the poor and pilgrims, and the third part was for themselves and their household to live with. And thus they lived 20 years in marriage without having any lineage. Then they promised our Lord that if he sent to them any lineage, they should give it to him for to serve him, for which thing they went every year into Jerusalem in 3 principal feasts, so that in the feast of Insenia, which was the dedication of the temple, then Joachim went unto Jerusalem with his kindred and came to the altar with the others and would have offered his offering. Here we see on the lower lintel Anne and Joachim, at the right entering the temple, a double arcade under an architectural canopy, which is the symbol of the earthly city of Jerusalem. And they put there their offerings for the Lord. The scroll of the law is unrolled on a stone altar below the eternal lamp, which is barely visible in the shadow under the right canopy. With one hand, the high priest, a bearded rabbi, rejects the couple's offering, and with the other he points to a text of the law which reads, according to Jacques of Voragine in the Golden Legend, "And when the priest saw him, he put him aside with great despite, and reproved him, because he came to the altar of God and said to him that it was only right that a man cursed in the faith should not offer to our Lord, nor he that was barren should be among them that had fruits, and he that had none to the increase of the people of God." And then Joachim, all confused for this thing, dared not go home for shame, afraid that those of his lineage and his neighbors who had heard it might reproach him. Then he went to his herdsman and was there a long time. Here on the far right, we see Joachim, his belongings in a kerchief on a staff, wearing what was considered in the iconography of hats of the High Middle Ages, a Jewish hat, departing for the wilderness with a friend. In the wilderness, an angel appears to Joachim with good news. And then the angel appeared to him only and comforted him with great clearness and said to him that he should not doubt nor be afraid of his vision, and said, I am the angel of our Lord, sent to thee to announce to thee that thy prayers have been answered and been heard, and thy alms have been mounted before our Lord. I have seen thy shame and heard the reproach. That thou art barren is to thee no reproach by right, and God is avenger of sin and not of nature. And when he closeth the belly or womb, he worketh so that he open it afterwards more marvelously. And the fruit that shall be born shall not be seen to come forth by lechery, but let it be known that it is a gift of God. And thy wife shall have a daughter, and thou shalt call her Mary. And she, as ye have avowed, shall be from her infancy sacred unto our Lord, and shall be full of the Holy Ghost, and since the time that she shall depart from the womb of her mother. And she shall dwell in the temple of our Lord, and not without, among the other people, because that none evil thing shall be had in suspicion of her. And right as she shall be born of a barren mother, so shall be born of her, marvelously, the Son of a right high Lord, of whom the name shall be Jesus, and by him shall health be given to all the people. And I give to thee the sign that when thou shalt come to the golden gate at Jerusalem, thou shalt meet there Anne thy wife, who is greatly moved by thy long tarrying, and shall have joy of their coming. And then the angel, when he had said this, departed from him. And as when Anne wept bitterly, and knew not whither her husband was gone, the same angel appeared to her, and said all that he had said to her husband, and gave to her for a sign that she should go into Jerusalem, to the golden gate, and there she should meet with her husband, which was returned. In the center right of the lower lintel, we see the angel speaking to Anne and Joachim from a cloud, and in the very center they meet at the golden gate, the opening in the eastern wall of Jerusalem through which the Messiah is supposed to enter, a perfect metaphor for the closed womb that will open and bear the Redeemer, or at least the Redeemer's mother. The events depicted on the left hand of the frieze take place some 14 years later and involve Mary's betrothal. Again, we read in the Golden Legend, and in the 14th year of her age, the bishop commanded in common that the virgins that were instituted in the temple and had accomplished the time of age should return to their houses and should after the law be married. At that came a voice out of the oracle and said that all that they were of the house of David that were supposed to be married and had no wife, that each of them should bring a rod to the altar, and his rod that flourished, and after the saying of Isaiah the Holy Ghost, sit in the form of a dove on it, he should be the man that should be engaged and married to the Virgin Mary. Here on the left we see the suitors, among whom Joseph, an old man on a horse. And Joseph of the house of David writes, And Joseph of the house of David was there among the others, a man of such old age as he was to have so tender a maid. And whereas others brought forth their rods, he hid his. And then Joseph, by the commandment of the bishop, brought forth his rod, and at once it flowered, and a dove descended from heaven thereupon, so that it was clearly the advice of every man that he should have the virgin. And then he married the Virgin Mary, and returned to his city of Bethlehem to ordain his household and his house, and to fetch such things as were necessary. In the temple, on the covered bema, we see the rods placed there overnight, and moving again to the left, we see what seems like Anne touching Joseph while the rejected suitors look on. And just to the right, Joseph, a high priest, Mary, Joachim, and Anne celebrate the marriage. Mary wears the coronet of a princess, and although she inclines her head to the priest, her hand reaches back for the hand of her father. In a subsequent scene, we see the angel informing Joseph that Mary's approaching maternity is divine, and he drops to his knees to beg forgiveness. Joseph and the Virgin go off hand in hand to Bethlehem. The upper lintel portrays the story of Christ's birth. The old man on the left with the beard is the prophet Isaiah, who has announced the coming of Jesus. On his left, the archangel Gabriel announces that she would conceive and become the mother of Jesus, Son of God. The Virgin lifts her hand to indicate that she accepts the divine mission. Next, we witness the visitation, in which Mary, who is pregnant with Jesus, visits her relative Elizabeth, who is pregnant with John the Baptist. The two women embrace. The central tableau represents the Nativity, Mary beneath the coverlet, Jesus in the cradle, the animals warming him with their breath, and people looking on from a chevroned ring, the shepherds outside, and the angels looking on from on high. In the whole right portion of the upper lintel, we discern Herod, the ruler of Judea at the time of Jesus' birth, the Magi, who have seen astrological signs of the birth of the King of the Jews, and the three kings with scepters. The upper part of the tympanum shows the Virgin in majesty with the Christ child, flanked by as yet unidentified religious and secular figures, with two censer-bearing angels. Above the lintels and tympanum, in the archvolts, we find 14 angels, 14 patriarchs, 16 prophets, and on the outer rim, 16 old men of the Apocalypse with musical instruments and viols as they were described by St. John the Divine. The jam statues around the south portal represent at the left St. Elijah, Queen of Sheba, Solomon, Peter holding the keys, and on the right, St. Paul, David, the Sibyl, and Isaiah. Moving now to the north portal, known as the Portal of the Virgin, or the Coronation Portal, we see Virgin and Child in the Trumeau, and on the left, Saint Denis, holding his head in his hands, is flanked by angels and a king. On the right side, we find Saints John the Baptist, Stephen, Genevieve, who was the patron saint of Paris, and Pope Sylvester. The doorposts and sides of the Trumeau depict signs of the zodiac and works of the months. From the upper right, clockwise, we see Cancer, Virgo, Libra, and moving up, a vintner with his barrel and a harvester sharpening his scythe. On the other side, bottom to top, we see Aries, Taurus, Gemini, and Leo, along with the rural labors of fall and winter. Two things should be noted here. First, that Paris of the 13th century was not so divorced from the surrounding countryside that the rural activities of sowing and planting were wholly absent. Second, the cathedral is the place where the community celebrates holidays according to the liturgical calendar, which features both the days of local and more universal saints, and is thus involved in the yearly cycle of the seasons, a carryover from the pagan past. On the lower lintel, we see Old Testament kings and prophets. They surround the Ark of the Covenant under a tabernacle. And on the upper lintel, we see the Dormition-like Assumption of the Virgin. Again, we understand the sculptural frieze better alongside James of Origene's Golden Legend, since scenes of Dormition, Assumption, and Coronation of the Virgin are not contained in the Bible, but, James tells us, we find in a book sent to St. John the Evangelist, which is said to be apocryphal and is ascribed to him, in what manner the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary took place. James tries to calculate the Virgin's age, stating that according to certain figures like Epiphanius, whom he names, She was 14 when she conceived, and 15 at the time of Jesus' birth. He lived 33 years, and she 24 years beyond his death, making her 72 at the time of her dormition and assumption. James claims that what we read elsewhere is more probable, that she lived after the ascension of her son 12 years, and so that she was 60 years old at the time of her death. Note here the scholastic method of pitting one source against another in order to arrive at some kind of synthetic truth. And on the day when all the apostles were spread, Jacques of Origine tells us, throughout the world in preaching, the glorious Virgin was greatly taken and embraced with the idea to be with her Son, Jesus Christ. An angel appears to Mary to inform her that her son awaits her, and she has 2 requests at that information. I pray thee more heartily that my sons and my brethren the apostles may be assembled with me, so that before I die I may see them with my bodily eyes. And also I pray and require that my spirit, issuing out of the body, see not the horrible nor wicked spirit nor fiend, and that no might of the devil come against me. John the Evangelist is carried on a cloud to Mary's house, as are the other 11 apostles. And when the Blessed Virgin saw all the apostles assembled, Jacques of Origine tells us, she blessed our Lord and sat in the midst of them, where the lamps, tapers, and lights burned. And about the 3rd hour of the night, Jesus Christ came with sweet melody and song, with the orders of the angels, the companies of patriarchs, the assembly of martyrs, the convents of confessors, the carols of virgins. And before the bed of our Blessed Lady, the companies of all these saints were set in order and made sweet song and melody. And what funeral rites were done of our Blessed Lady, and there hallowed it is all said and taught to the foresaid book, which is attributed to St. John. Mary goes directly to heaven, and at the 3rd day Jesus Christ came with a great multitude of angels and saluted them and said, Peace be with you. And they answered, God, glory be to thee, which only make the great miracles and marvels. And our Lord said to the apostles, What is now your advice that I ought now to do to my mother of honor and of grace? Sir, it seems to us thy servants that as thou hast vanquished death and reign in the world without end, that thou should raise also the body of thy mother and set it on thy right side in eternity. And he granted it. And then Michael the angel came and presented the soul of Mary to our Lord. And the Savior spoke and said, Arise up, haste thee, my culver or dove, tabernacle of glory, vessel of life, temple celestial. And as thou never felt conceiving by any touch, thou shalt not suffer in the grave any corruption of body. And then the soul came again to the body of Mary, and issued gloriously out of the tomb, and thus was received in the heavenly chamber, and a great company of angels with her. Mary's body suffers no decomposition. 3 virgins come to wash her corpse, and the apostles carry her body to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and was placed in a jeweled tomb, which was supposedly seen by medieval crusaders in Palestine. Interestingly, Jacques of Origine tells us that Mary leaves behind her clothes, and mentions specifically the holy tunic, which will show up in Chartres some 10 centuries later, via the grandson of Charlemagne, Charles the Bald. Here we see the apostles laying Mary in her tomb, and on the very top we see Mary at the right hand of the Son, crowned by an angel. This is where we must stop for today. In our next time together, we shall examine the central portal of the west facade of Notre Dame, along with the magnificent stained glass windows on the west, south, and north sides of the cathedral. Welcome back to the Age of Cathedrals. In our last time together, we outlined some of the innovations associated with Gothic cathedrals and began to explore the elaborate sculptural program on the outer walls of Notre Dame in Paris, beginning with the tympanum frieze and the jam statues on the south entrance of the west facade, the Portal of St. Anne, which depicts the events surrounding the marriage of Mary's mother, St. Anne, Mary's marriage, and the birth of Jesus. We moved to the north portal, known as the Portal of the Virgin, and followed the story of Mary's death and ascension to heaven. The centerpiece of the west facade of Notre Dame is the central tympanum, the Portal of the Last Judgment, depicting Christ of the Second Coming and the end of human time. The door jambs depict on the left Saints Peter, John, Andrew, James the Less, Simeon, Bartholomew, and on the right, Saints Paul, James the Major, Thomas, Philip, Jude, and Matthew. The trumeau, which you will remember was removed in the 18th century but was restored by Viollet-le-Duc in the 19th, depicts Christ alive and on earth. In making sense of Gothic cathedrals, our eyes often move from the lower parts, which depict Christ's earthly life as a preacher, the Word of God, upward toward his return at the end of time and role in the Last Judgment. On the bottom lintel, we see souls rising from the dead, fully clothed. These are people of all social classes and even diverse races, as there is plausible evidence of a black among them on the upper left next to the trumpeting angel. On the upper lintel we see to our right, but to Christ's left, the damned are being led away to eternal damnation. Note in the hell side of the voussoir the terrifying image of the souls in hell being stuffed into a boiling pot, while horned devils carry off a crowned king. Note too the image of lasciviousness and lust in the form of a naked woman with simian facial characteristics and a chain around her neck, sitting on top of a bishop, still wearing his mitre hat, and a king with his crown. To our left, but Christ's right, the saved are being shepherded to heaven. Between the saved and the damned, we see the archangel Michael with the scales of justice, which another horned devil with a devilish grin is trying to tip with what looks like a crowbar, while the soul in the other basket of the scales holds her hands in prayer. In the tympanum sits Christ in majesty, the stigmata showing on his hands, and surrounded by angels bearing the instruments of the Passion. The left angel holds 3 nails in one hand and the lance in the other. The right angel supports the cross. The kneeling figures have been identified as the Virgin and St. John. All around the archvolts, again, we find patriarchs, elders of the Apocalypse, and Old Testament figures. Note in the lower right of this detail the image of the figure of Moses, who can be identified by the tablets of the law in his right hand, the rod with which he smote the rock in his left hand, and horns coming out of his head. The emblem of Moses is horns, due to St. Jerome's mistranslation of the Hebrew word keren, which can mean either radiated light or grew horns. The central entrance to the central cathedral in the central city of the center of Europe in the 13th century embodies a great theological rendering of justice, the separation of the good and bad, the saved and the damned. Yet it is also surrounded by biblical history and by allegory from the pagan past. Zodiac signs, which are of Persian origin, and scenes of rural life from classical tradition, the tradition of works and days, such as we find in the classical author Hesiod. On either side of the door jambs, as at Saint-Denis, we find the parable of the wise and foolish virgins. Below the standing jamb sculptures, figures of virtue and vice, virtue above, vice below, from the ancient world. Below the left jamb, we see faith and infidelity, hope and despair, charity and avarice, purity and injustice, prudence and folly, humility and pride. And below the right jamb, we see fortitude and cowardice, temperance and wrath, kindness and cruelty, peace and discord, obedience and disobedience, perseverance and inconstancy. These emblems are less theological and fall more into the realm of internalized moral qualities. Entering now the door of Notre Dame in Paris, we are struck by the incredible emanation of light through stained glass, crowned by the great rose windows. It is true that Saint-Denis had rose windows, but they are relatively small in comparison to the huge and hugely complex program of Notre Dame's south, north, and western rose windows. The oldest rose at Notre Dame, that of the western facade, belongs to what is called the encyclopedic type. It is a mirror of nature, containing, as on the outside, signs of the zodiac, works of the months, virtues and vices, all around the periphery, and in the middle, the Virgin and Child, surrounded by 12 prophets. At the top of the middle circle, we can identify the vice of idolatry, and just to the right, anger, and at 2:30, cowardice, where we see a rabbit chasing a knight who has dropped his sword. At 10:30, we see luxury or vanity in the form of a richly dressed woman admiring herself in the mirror. The virtues continue on the outer circle with faith, hope, and charity, and with the works of the months. Here we see January, from Janos meaning door, with its two faces, one looking back and the other forward, and December with its winter feasting. The western rose window mirrors the sculptural program on the outside with its signs of the zodiac, works of the seasons, and virtues and vices. Much of it is, however, now hidden from view by the pipes of Notre Dame's organ, which dates from the 19th century. The northern rose window at Notre Dame was put in place under Jean de Chelles around 1250 and is dedicated to the glorification of the Virgin Mary. At the center, the Virgin Mother, surrounded by a circle of 16 prophets and patriots, sits. We know that they are Old Testament prophets because they wear the hats associated with Jews in medieval iconography, and because of the emblematic scrolls that might ordinarily contain the words of their prophecy, but which in this instance contain their names. At the very top, for example, we see the prophet Hosea, and to the left at 11 o'clock, the prophet Isaiah. At 8:30, Jeremiah. It is fascinating to notice that on the lower part of the circle, at around 5:30, we see the figure not of a prophet, but of Pharaoh, who is lying down asleep, dreaming of the 7 fat and 7 lean cows, a dream associated with the patriarch Joseph's exile in Egypt. In the middle circle, we find another series of Old Testament figures. At 12:30, King Solomon. At 5 o'clock, King David with his harp. And to the left of David, at 5:30, sits Moses, horned, as we saw in the sculpture of the west facade, holding the tablets of the law, on one of which is written the word Eudikes, judge, and on the other is written his name, Moses. An outer rim of 32 medallions is dedicated to the judges and kings of Israel and Judah. It is surrounded by 36 trefoils or clovers, which contain figures of kings and priests. In the lancet windows below, we find a gallery of Old Testament kings, which mirrors the gallery of kings along the bridge between the two towers of the west facade of Notre Dame. The south rose window, begun in 1258, is a variation of the northern. At the center, we find Christ of the Apocalypse, the sword of judgment on his lap. Christ is surrounded by what was known as the tetramorph, the symbols of the four evangelists. On the top, the eagle, associated with John, along with man, associated with Matthew. On the bottom, the ox, associated with St. Luke, and to the left and right of Christ, lions, the symbol of St. Mark. 12 rays emanate from the center and contain the images of apostles, saints, martyrs, and kings, and even scenes from the Old Testament, as this image at 9 o'clock of the judgment of Solomon. Notice the two women standing in front of Solomon with the baby in the middle, and a man with a sword ready to cut the baby in half. A third ring of circular medallions contains 24 assorted saints, virgins, and martyrs, and the outer row of 24 trefoil clovers shows angels with various accessories, crowns, incense, candles, mixed with several New Testament scenes, such as at 9 o'clock, this flight of Joseph, Mary, and Jesus into Egypt. The south rose window thus presents Christ in majesty, surrounded by an enormous celestial court. Filled as it is with biblical figures, the cathedral functioned in an age in which only a small portion of the population could read as the Bible of the poor. Those who prayed and might look at the biblical stories depicted in sculpture and stained glass as a way of remembering or of illustrating sacred history. Those who preached might point to biblical figures and stories as a way of visually emphasizing the works of Scripture. How is it, then, that so many of the forms belonging to the great rose windows of Notre Dame and elsewhere are not visible from the ground to the naked eye? This is a mystery to which there is no single answer. Could it have been that it didn't matter? Light came through the window as a kind of grace that rendered sacred whatever it fell upon, making biblical history part of the present? Or could it be that, like certain figures on the tops of cathedrals, visible only to the eye of God, that whether or not men could see them, they nonetheless brought his blessing upon the community of the faithful? In our next time together, we shall examine the sculpture all around the outside of the great rose windows of Notre Dame in Paris. Welcome back to the Age of Cathedrals. In our last time together, we looked at the great central entrance to Notre Dame in Paris, the portal of the Last Judgment, along with some of the stained glass of the great west, north, and south rose windows. Today, we shall again exit the cathedral and walk around it. We shall examine the sculptures along the southern and northern entrances and sides of the nave. In the southern transept, which is known as St. Stephen's Portal, we find a record of Notre Dame's original dedication to St. Stephen. Stephen, who was the first martyr of Christianity, was originally one of the deacons appointed by the apostles to distribute charitable aid to widows. The Trumeau shows him dressed in deacon's robes and carrying a book. Stephen was known for his skill in debating and is seen in the lower lintel of the tympanum over the south entrance of Notre Dame, disputing in the synagogues. Here, in the left 2 tableaux of the lower lintel of the south entrance to Notre Dame, we see Stephen, who is seated holding out his finger as if he were engaged in heated debate. The others, who are both standing and sitting, seem confused. The 2 seated men are looking at Stephen, while those standing look either into the distance or at each other. The bearded man, second from the left, is holding both his beard and his head, as if he were genuinely confounded. On the right hand, we see Stephen standing with 3 of his opponents seated below him, as if on the ground. The man on the far right is taking notes. Having vanquished his opponents in the synagogue, Stephen is taken by force to the Jewish court of the Sanhedrin. There he is tried for blasphemy against Moses and God, for saying, as we read in Acts 6:12, that Jesus of Nazareth shall destroy the temple and shall change the traditions which Moses delivered unto us. Then Stephen, looking up steadfastly to heaven, saw the glory of God, and Jesus standing on the right hand of God, and said, Behold, I see the heavens opened, and the Son of Man standing on the right hand of God. At which point a mob ran violently upon him. Stephen was stoned to death in 34 or 35 AD by a crowd led by no other than Saul of Tarsus, the future St. Paul. In the right portion of the upper lintel, we see Stephen's body being placed in a sarcophagus, while overhead Christ, flanked by 2 angels and separated from the earthly realm by clouds, watches on. Interestingly, the entrance devoted to St. Stephen, who was known for his powers of debate, both faces the nascent University of Paris and contains a series of plaques known as dados, devoted to student life. Some of these, as in the instance in the upper left, clearly reference the scenes of debate in the lower lintel of the south entrance. Notice the student on the upper panel on the far left, who drives home a point with his fellow debaters, while the others, as in the case of Stephen debating in the synagogue, look on. Moving to the right, we detect what appears to be the master or magister, the teacher, deciding between the 2 debating parties and pronouncing a judgment or sententia, as if it were a judicial sentence upon the issue at hand. Moving now 180 degrees around the cathedral, the northern transept entrance to Notre Dame is dedicated again to the Virgin. The lower lintel contains episodes from the infancy of Christ. On the far left, Christ's birth with the manger, this time under the bed along with the tending animals, and above the bed the dove of the Holy Spirit. To the right, we see Christ presented to Simeon in the temple, and just right of center, Herod issues orders for the slaughter of all the boys of Bethlehem, which is depicted in the scene of a beseeching mother on her knees before the Roman soldiers wielding swords. And on the far right, Mary and Joseph flee with the infant Jesus into Egypt. The upper registers on the north side contain the story of the miracle of Theophilus, which is one of the great archetypal tales from the Middle Ages that was used as an example in preaching and had passed into modernity in the shape of Goethe's Faust story. Theophilus is the tale of a lowly cleric who lived in Sicily in the 6th century and who served the bishop as his administrator. Theophilus was so effective as an administrator that when the bishop died, the populace acclaimed him their new bishop. Theophilus, however, was a humble man and preferred to have someone else acclaimed bishop in his place. The new bishop, perhaps recognizing with envy the superior administrative skills of the man he displaced, deprived Theophilus of his more humble office. This caused Theophilus to fall into such despair that he sought the advice of a Jewish sorcerer. The sorcerer summoned the devil, who agreed to help Theophilus, providing that he renounce Christ and his mother along with the Catholic faith, and that he sign a contract to that effect with his own blood. Theophilus's clerical office is thus restored, and he became a generous distributor of riches and goods to the parish, and in some versions he became the builder of a new church. In time, however, Theophilus came to his senses and was filled with regret. He sought the help of the Virgin Mother, whose role is that of intercessor. Mary scolds Theophilus but takes him back, as he renounces the devil and professes his faith in her and in Christ. The Virgin then retrieves by force the contract that Theophilus signed in blood, and the redeemed sinner went straight to the bishop to recount what had happened. He then dies peacefully 3 days later. One of those figures like Saint Denis, Theophilus is everywhere in the period we are studying, and his presence is not limited to church sculpture. There are some 10 Theophilus cycles in French and English illuminated manuscripts. Nor is the Theophilus story limited to a Gothic phenomenon, since one of the most interesting and beautiful representations of Theophilus is to be found in the Romanesque abbey church of Souillac in southern France. The Souillac Theophilus features the scene of the signing and exchange of the charter, and of the devil placing his hands over those of Theophilus, a gesture from the world of military feudalism. In the ceremony known as homage, a man of greater means became the lord of a man of lesser means by placing his hands over those of his vassal. Theophilus also figures in no fewer than 8 stained glass programs of the 13th century, the most elaborate of which is to be found in the Cathedral of Beauvais. Here, for example, we see Theophilus making his written pact with the devil, and here the devil makes Theophilus his man with the placing of hands. In the upper scene, which stretches across 2 quadrants, Theophilus uses his newfound wealth to build a church, as 2 hods carry a basket of cement up what looks like a flying buttress, and another lays courses of stone on top of a wall. The Beauvais Theophilus cycle also shows him seated as a bishop and distributing alms, a little devil at his side, and in the upper 2 quadrants receiving gifts, in this instance a fish on a platter. Eventually, however, Theophilus enters a church where he prays to a statue of the Virgin. And finally, after his death, the bishop reads a scroll containing the story of Theophilus. In the Notre Dame stone rendering of the Theophilus story, we observe his making of a pact with the devil, who as Lord places his hands over those of his vassal. In the middle right of the upper lintel of the north entrance to the cathedral, Theophilus as bishop distributes alms. A little devil, as in the Beauvais example, at his side. Though the Theophilus tale is depicted visually, both in stained glass and in stone, it is fundamentally a tale of sculpture. In seeking Mary's aid, the repentant cleric prays to a statue of the Virgin, a figural sculpture within sculpture, just as the statue itself is enclosed within a miniature church with 2 towers and a trefoil tracery topped by a gabled roof, a church within a church. On the far right, the Virgin Mary, wielding a sword, takes back the charter from the devil on his knees. Theophilus is a tale about writing, about charters, written and retrieved. And the poet Rutebeuf, who lived in 13th century Paris, and who either saw the sculptural story of Theophilus or inspired it, produced a written version of the miracle of Theophilus, where we read the following about the scene in stone. Our Lady speaks, "Theophilus, I once knew you, when you served me long ago. Now in your need, trust me to redeem the deed that ignorance made you concede. I'll fetch it back." Our Lady raises her cross, the devil falls, and she treads him underfoot. Mary returns the written pact with the devil to the repentant sinner with specific instructions. According to Rutebuff, now Our Lady shall carry the covenant back to Theophilus and says, "My friend, I bring the charter back. Your soul's ship was almost wrecked without hope of better luck. Now hear my words. Go to the bishop. Do not wait. Give him the charter that you made to read aloud inside the church before a crowd, so that good men are not seduced by such deceit." In the tympanum of the north portal of Notre Dame, we see the bishop, with Theophilus in attendance, telling his story, holding up a book, possibly the very book we're reading. For Theophilus goes to the bishop, tells his story, and asks that this be read so that others may not be deceived. We read in Rutebuff that the bishop shall read the charter and say, "The bishop for Jesus' sake, Mary's son, good people, listen, for you shall learn of Theophilus, whom the devil cheated by his guile." Here we have an excellent example of one of the most important functions both of literature and of church sculpture, that is, moral prescript, to teach right action and to avoid committing unwise deeds. After all, the name Theophilus itself means love of God. We also encounter in the combined visual and verbal versions of the Theophilus story an important lesson in the fundamentals of Gothic architecture. The bishop reads the whole story of Theophilus in what is an inscription of the tale within the tale, what was known as a mise en abîme, just as Theophilus in sculpture involves sculpture within sculpture. I want to leave you today with a suggestion that this principle of identical smaller things within larger ones, whether books within books or sculpture within sculpture, is one of the prime principles of Gothic architecture. Indeed, one of the mental structures of the age. You might think of this as a fascination with the layering of forms within forms. It can be seen in the scholastic mode of thought and theses that also took shape in the shadow of Notre Dame de Paris in the very decades of which we are speaking. St. Thomas Aquinas would arrange his Summa Theologica as a series of major and minor theses, addressing questions as a series of categories, subcategories, and sub-subcategories. Similarly, the cathedral was built in modules of structure, independent bays, which correspond to the homologous parts within parts of scholastic thought. It was decorated along lines of such imbricated forms, similar shapes within shapes, which, as we can see in this image of the whole of the north portal, are integrated to form an architectonic whole. All along the area by which one enters the church, we find smaller pointed gables within gables. At the mid-level, we find smaller lancet windows within larger ones. On either side of the great rose window, we see little chapels holding jam statues, and on top of the counter buttress of the right, a finial in the shape of a small church. At the very top, more chapel-like finials on either side of a large ocular window, containing 6 smaller ones, with another at the center to form small concentric circles within a larger one. As the great art historian Erwin Panofsky noted, the basic principle of Gothic stone buildings is thoroughly analogous to the scholastic synthesis of great theological and philosophical truths. In our next time together, we shall look more closely at Peter Abelard, the great thinker and priest scholastic who lived and loved in the very space on which the construction of Notre Dame will begin some 2 decades after his death. Welcome back to the Age of Cathedrals. In our last time together, we looked at the southern and northern portal entrances to Notre Dame in Paris. The all-important tympanum of the first contains the story of the stoning of St. Stephen, the first Christian martyr, and the tympanum of the second displays the story of Christ's infancy, along with the miracle story of Theophilus, who makes a pact with the devil, repents, and is saved by the Virgin, who redeems the charter signed in blood. The whole is capped by the bishop who reads Theophilus' story to the assembly of the faithful, in this tale that involves at least 3 scenes of writing. The advent of writing within what had been an essentially oral culture was one of the great features of the Age of Cathedrals. One cannot overestimate the extent to which orality, and especially the sacredness of oaths, was privileged over written expression in preceding centuries. Many literary forms existed only orally. Public rites and ceremonies were conducted orally, as were legal proceedings, under the assumption that written law was hopelessly material, manipulable, and contained the letter of the law and not its spirit. The miracle of Theophilus, however, with its devilish bargains and contracts, summons the world of commerce with its written records and charters. It is finally a relativist, even an existentialist tale. Who one is, how one acts, is a function of one's situation and relation to others. Before he is wronged, Theophilus is a faithful Christian. When he's wronged by the bishop, he passes to the devil's side. Having exhausted the things of this world, Theophilus reverts back to the Virgin. The saved Christian is, finally, a realist and a rationalist. And if we read the miracle of Theophilus from the point of view of emerging urban values, he is a supreme strategist who talks his way out of 2 difficult and quite opposed situations. Theophilus underlines the value and importance of negotiation. Now, if ever there was a rationalist, a rationalizer, a relativist, it is Peter Abelard, who lived, wrote, and worked in the first half of the 12th century on Paris's left bank, or Latin Quarter. Here we see him depicted in a 19th century rendering by Jules Cavelier. Today, we will spend our time discussing Abelard and the rise of the scholastic method of debate in the emerging university. As we know from Abelard's autobiography, which he delicately titles The Story of My Misfortunes, Abelard was born at some geographic distance from Paris. He is from the borders of Brittany, which was considered in the 12th century a wild, uncivilized place. Abelard claims that the name Brittany comes from that of Brutus, a descendant of the Trojan hero Aeneas, who was supposedly the founder and first king of Britain. Using an argument based on etymology, Abelard maintains that not all Bretons are brutes, but most are. Abelard's move from Brittany to Paris was in line with the rebirth of cities and the rise of a money economy and long-range trade routes in the 12th century. Cathedral building, which began just around the time of Abelard's death in 1142, was no less a part of this urban renewal. Abelard, one among many who moved from countryside to the capital, was a mobile sort, a mover and shaker, a shifter, the very figure of an itinerant scholar planted in Paris on the Montagne Sainte-Geneviève, in the space of philosophy, as distinct from theology, in a new space within the city, one that is still there, that is to say, the university. We have seen just how closely the cathedral and the university were linked in the series of bas-reliefs or dados on the south side of the nave of Notre Dame, the side facing the Latin or the student quarter. In the upper quadrant, which is a quadrifoil, we see what may be a master and students, or a group of students, some seated and some standing, poring over the pages of books. Note that all around the framing quadrifoil, we detect more casual scenes of frivolity, with a kind of animals, some real and some phantasmatic, that one finds in the margins of medieval Gothic manuscripts. In the upper dados, students seem anxious to engage what appears to be the face of a woman in a window in the upper right, and a woman coming down the stairs on a ladder to greet a couple of students below. The lower right again shows a woman wearing not the cowl of male students, but a wimple in a scene of potential mixed social life. It is rare to see such scenes of everyday life, especially in the context of the cathedral, whose statues in stained glass are filled with figures and stories from the Old and New Testaments, from the Apocrypha, or even from hagiographical history, saints' lives, like the miracle of Theophilus. Abelard, or one of his fellow students from a slightly later period, could have been one of the socializing, reading, debating, or lecturing figures on the dados of the south side of Notre Dame. Abelard was a new type of man in Paris of the 12th century. We can see the difference in the generational divide that separates him from his father. Abelard's father was a knight, and Abelard a man of letters, a shift he describes as a move from Mars to Minerva, from military arms to verbal dispute and debate. I was so carried away by my love of learning, he writes, that I renounced the glory of a soldier's life, made over my inheritance and rights of the eldest son to my brothers, and withdrew from the court of Mars in order to kneel at the feet of Minerva. I preferred the weapons of dialectic to all the other teachings of philosophy, and armed with these, I chose the conflicts of disputation instead of the trophies of war. Within the world of awakening letters, sometimes referred to as the Renaissance of the 12th century, Abelard is a young Turk up against the theological establishment, especially the gray eminence of Anselm of Laon. I approached this old man, he brags, who owed his reputation more to long practice than to intellect or memory. Anyone who knocked at his door to seek an answer to some question went away more uncertain than he came. Anselm could win the admiration of an audience, but he was useless when put to the question. This put to the question takes us in the direction of Abelard's great, irritating intervention in the history of philosophy, and bespeaks the shift from theology to philosophy, from belief to logic, which is synonymous with the rise of the university. What was most offensive to Abelard's rivals, as well as to ecclesiastical authority, right up to the Pope, is that Abelard turns the dialectics, the modes of reasoning of the pagan philosophers, upon the tenets of theology. This is the meaning of the passage, where he states, "One day it happened that after a session of sentences, we students were joking among ourselves, when someone rounded on me and asked what I thought of the reading of the Holy Scriptures, when I had hitherto studied only philosophy. I replied that concentration on such reading was most beneficial for the salvation of the soul, but that I found it most surprising that for educated men, the writings or glosses of the fathers themselves were not sufficient for interpreting their commentaries without further instruction." This session of sentences refers to the mode of teaching according to what was known as the Lectio Divina, an exposition verse by verse according to the writings of the Church Fathers, which produces glosses, an understanding of the letter, the sense, and the deeper meaning or sentence of Holy Scripture. Abelard, on the other hand, wants to read the Bible without commentary. He wants immediate contact with the text. He is a close reader, and what today would be considered a new critic or a deconstructionist. A prime example of Abelard's confrontation of an ancient theological problem head-on, without authority, can be found in his treatment of the core theological issue of the relationship of the three of the Trinity to the one of the Trinity in logical terms. Now it happened, he writes, that I first applied myself to lecturing on the basis of our faith by an analogy with human reason, and composed a theological treatise on the unity and trinity of God for the use of my students who were asking for human and logical reasons on this subject, and demanded something more intelligible rather than mere words. In fact, they said that words were useless if the intelligence could not follow them, that nothing could be believed unless it was first understood, and that it was absurd for anyone to preach to others what neither he nor those he taught could grasp with understanding. Abelard wants to introduce reason into faith, and he ends up, finally, by inserting the question of the Trinity into the ancient debate, revived in the late 11th century by Rosselin of Compiègne, concerning the status of universal linguistic terms, that is, the question of whether common nouns refer to ideas which actually exist somewhere, are real, and to which all particular references refer. Let's say that the idea or ideal of a table exists, of which all the tables we encounter with our senses are degraded images. Or, on the other hand, whether a common noun, like table, is simply a verbal term, a name, a sort of composite picture of all the particular tables to which it might refer. In the first instance, a philosophy known as realism, words are connected in some organic way to the things they designate. In the second, known as nominalism, they are more detached and signify more powerfully in relation to each other than to the things to which they refer. Abelard caused an enormous stir when he turned such a tool of linguistic and philosophical analysis upon the core theological issue of the Trinity. He maintained that the difference between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit was either substantial, that is to say real, or it was accidental. If the difference is substantial, that is real, then the one of the Trinity cannot be three. If the difference between the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is accidental, that is merely verbal, then they cannot be one. Put another way, there would be no place in which their unity might reside. Abelard's solution to this problem was to posit a third term between these two possibilities. The three persons of the Trinity inhere, he maintained, is an idea in the mind, an intellectio, on the model of the way that abstract nouns signify both the existence of an ideal substance and the division of that substance into particular objects in material reality. This outraged the ecclesiastical authorities. Saint Bernard, in particular, denounced Abelard to Pope Innocent II, whom he had helped install as supreme pontiff, which led to Abelard's condemnation at the Council of Sens in 1140. Abelard tells the story, in which they compelled me to throw my book, meaning his book on the Trinity, into the fire with my own hands. Abelard hoped to appeal this decree directly to Rome, but on July 16, 1141, Pope Innocent II excommunicated Abelard, imposed perpetual silence upon him, and ordered him confined to a monastery, a sentence from which he was saved only through the intervention of Peter the Venerable, abbot of Cluny, and by old age, since Abelard died less than a year later. Abelard was a humanist. He cites classical authors, Ovid, Cicero, Horace, and Seneca, alongside of the fathers of the Church. In contrast with St. Augustine's condemnation of the concupiscence of the letter, by which Augustine meant too great a love of words, Abelard loved letters. He was seduced by letters, and seduced with letters. First as a teacher, it is said that Abelard attracted students from all over Europe, and at one point he tries to escape the throngs. I retired to a priory, he tells us, where I could devote myself to teaching, as before. Yet there my pupils gathered in crowds until there were too many for the place to hold or the land to support. Abelard's popularity as a teacher led him to pride, and pride led him to romance. I began to think of myself, he bragged, as the only philosopher in the world, with nothing to fear from anyone, and so I yielded to the lusts of the flesh. I feared no rebuff from any woman I might choose to honor with my love. In what is one of the first cases of love between a teacher and pupil, Abelard was hired by the secular canon Fulbert to teach his niece Eloise, who lived in the vicinity of where Notre Dame in Paris would be built. The teacher admired his pupil's learning. In looks, he tells us, she did not rank lowest, while in the extent of her learning, she stood supreme. Letters and learning were for Abelard a means of seduction. Knowing the girl's knowledge and love of letters, I thought she would be all the more ready to consent, and that even when separated we could enjoy each other's presence by exchange of written messages in which we could speak more openly than in person, and so never need lack the pleasure of conversation. Here we see Abelard and Eloise in a manuscript illumination from the Romance of the Rose of the 14th century. In truth, Abelard was not entirely dishonest in his intentions toward Eloise. Indeed, they were married secretly, despite the qualms of both lovers regarding the incompatibility of marriage and philosophy. And they even had a son, whose name, Astrolabe, points in the direction of the new sciences of the 12th century. Naming your child Astrolabe in the 12th century would be like naming a child today something like Silicon Valley or Microsoft. It is their marriage, and not the seduction, that sparks Fulbert's fury. In eloping as they did, Abelard removed Eloise from the marriage market. And in retaliation, Fulbert's men captured Abelard and removed his testicles, which supreme egoist that he was, he took as a sign of divine election. How just the judgment of God, he writes, had struck me in the parts of the body with which I had sinned, and how just a reprisal had been taken by the very man I had myself betrayed. Castration only increased Abelard's philosophical powers. The hand of the Lord had touched me, he writes, for the express purpose of freeing me from the temptations of the flesh and the distraction of the world, so that I could devote myself to learning, and thereby prove myself a true philosopher, not of the world, but of God. In our next time together, we shall explore this conflict between the philosophies of the world, or of worldliness, and of God, as we look next at a type of literature which flourished in the towns which gave rise to cathedrals and to the university, the comic verse tales known as the fabliaux.